Chapter 1. The Dusty Welcome. The sun had barely risen over the distant mountains, casting long shadows across the rugged land, when Charlotte Harper arrived in the town of Redemption. It was a name she had heard whispered with both reverence and wariness in the last few days, a place where hopes were as fragile as the dry earth beneath her boots. And yet a place that needed change. The horses' hooves clattered against the dusty road, sending up small puffs of the fine dirt that seemed to permeate everything in this frontier town. The air was crisp with the chill of autumn, though the promise of warmth from the sun soon began to chase the cold away. Charlotte had imagined her arrival 100 times, but never had she expected it to be quite so stark. The town seemed to grow out of the earth itself, clinging to life with a stubbornness that mirrored the people living there. Redemption had a harsh beauty to it, the kind that could only be forged by a history of survival. The buildings stood like sentinels against the rolling plains, their wooden facades weathered and worn from years of neglect, but standing proud nonetheless. The air smelled of dust, leather, and the faintest hint of something green, perhaps the last stubborn remnants of summer, trying to hold on to its fading life. Charlotte shifted in the saddle, tugging at the reins of her horse to slow it as they passed the first row of storefronts. Her gaze moved from one end of the street to the other, taking in the sight of the dry, cracked sidewalks, the sagging wooden steps leading into businesses that had long since seen better days. The windows were dim, some with broken panes patched with ragged cloth or wooden planks. There was no sign of the bustle she had expected, no children running through the streets, no shops brimming with goods, only silence, broken by the occasional creak of a porch swing or the murmur of voices too low to catch. A few men loitered on the street corners, their eyes narrowing as they watched her approach. Their weather-beaten faces were hardened from years of toil, and there was no kindness in their gazes, only suspicion. She could feel their eyes on her, as though they were weighing her presence, sizing her up. She knew what they were thinking. Another woman, likely from the East, looking to tame their wild town with nothing more than a few books and a stubborn idealism. She couldn't say she blamed them. Redemption was a town where dreams came to die, not flourish. It was a place that had survived by its wits and grit, where hope was something distant, like the mountains on the horizon. Charlotte straightened in the saddle, steeling herself against the uncomfortable weight of their stares. She had come here for a reason, and nothing, no amount of doubt, no matter how harsh the looks, could change that. She was here to teach, to bring something better to these people who had lived through so much hardship that they no longer remembered what it was to dream. She could feel it in the air, the heavy, lingering sense of resignation that seemed to hang over the town. But Charlotte refused to believe that this place had no future. She couldn't. Not when there were children here who deserved better than a life of dust and drudgery. Her gaze swept over the few small houses that dotted the outskirts of the town, their rough-hewn walls standing like sentinels to an era long past. She could see the ghosts of families who had once lived here, their names lost to time, their hopes and dreams scattered like the wind. Redemption, she thought, was a place that needed saving, even if only in small, quiet ways, and it was her job to do just that. As she guided her horse toward the modest building that would serve as the schoolhouse, her heart swelled with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. She would teach, she would bring knowledge and hope to these children, she would give them something to aspire to, something beyond the dust and the endless horizon. And in doing so she would save herself as well, for she had come here to escape the confines of a life that had never quite fit, to step into the unknown and create a new world where she could be of use, a world where she could be more than just a woman confined to the role society dictated. The wind stirred again, sending a swirl of dust dancing across the street. Charlotte tightened her grip on the reins, squared her shoulders and rode forward, determined to meet whatever challenges lay ahead. Redemption had its flaws, its scars, its past, but she would make it her future. no matter what it took. She had come to bring light to the darkness, and she would not fail. Charlotte dismounted with a quiet sigh, her boots sinking into the dry earth as she stood before the old. The structure was a far cry from the grand institutions she had imagined when she first dreamed of teaching in the West. The weathered building was modest at best, its faded white walls peeling in patches, and the wooden steps creaked beneath her feet as she ascended to the front door. Still, there was something about the place that tugged at her heart, a quiet promise that whispered on the wind. She knew that with time she could make this place bloom. The schoolhouse stood at the end of the street, isolated from the saloon and the dusty general store, as if the town itself were reluctant to offer up its heart. To most, it would have seemed a mere relic, a forgotten structure left to decay, but Charlotte saw it differently. She imagined the children that would sit at those weathered desks, their faces filled with hope and curiosity. She could almost hear the sound of their laughter echoing through the empty halls, a sound that had yet to be born in this town. She moved toward the door, a key clutched in her hand. As she turned it in the lock, the door groaned open, revealing a room that was as sparse as the exterior. Wooden floors scuffed by years of use, empty windows that let in the grey light of a cloudy sky, and walls in desperate need of fresh paint. But there was still something in the air, something alive in the silence. She could almost feel the ghosts of lessons once taught, the faint remnants of children's eager footsteps, and the longing for a future that had not yet come. Charlotte crossed the threshold, her footsteps hesitant at first, but growing surer with each step. The room was small, but she had seen far worse in her time. Her fingers brushed over the worn edges of a desk that still held the ghosts of past hands, and she imagined them filled with children who had a thirst for something more, something beyond the endless dust storms and the whispering winds of the frontier. She would give them that, she promised herself. She would make this place a haven for learning, a place where the town's children could leave their troubles behind, even if only for a few hours each day. She wandered toward the blackboard, which stood unused and covered in a fine layer of dust. A single window near the back of the room framed a view of the wide, desolate plains stretching out into the horizon. The scene was breathtaking in its stark beauty, but to Charlotte it was also a reminder of the hard lives many of these children would face. She felt a pang of sorrow for them, knowing the struggle that awaited each one when they left the classroom and returned to the unforgiving world outside. But that was why she was here. She was here to change that, to give them a glimpse of a future beyond the dirt roads and sagging houses, a future where they could dream, where they could learn to believe that there was more to life than simply surviving. She would pour everything she had into this school, into these children. She would build something better for them, something worth fighting for. The faint sound of footsteps approaching interrupted her thoughts. She turned just as a figure rounded the corner of the building, an elderly man with stooped shoulders and a weathered face. His clothes were simple but neat, and there was a warmth in his eyes that seemed at odds with the harshness of the land around them. "Ah, I thought I might find you here," he said in a voice that cracked with age, though there was a hint of mischief in his smile. "My name's Amos Cartwright, been in this town longer than I care to admit, and I reckon you're the new teacher." Charlotte nodded, offering a smile of her own. "I am, Charlotte Harper." "Pleased to meet you, Miss Harper," he said, tipping his hat in a polite gesture. "I've seen a lot of folks come and go through Redemption, but there's something about you that feels different. You've got the look of someone who won't be so easy to run off." She chuckled softly. "I don't intend to be run off, Mr. Cartwright. I'm here for the long haul." "Good, good," he muttered, stepping closer as he surveyed the schoolhouse with a critical eye. "It'll need a fair bit of work to get it into proper shape, but I reckon you know that already. Ain't no easy task to fix a place like this up, especially with what's been going on around here lately." Charlotte arched an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" The old man's gaze shifted to the horizon, his eyes clouding as he seemed to search for the right words. "Well, you'll hear all kinds of things in town, depending on who you ask. Some folks say Redemption's been cursed since the day it was founded. Folks come, they try to make a go of it, but then something always happens. The crops fail, the rains stop, or worse, there's talk of people going missing, of things that can't be explained. But you'll hear all that soon enough, I reckon." Charlotte shivered at his words, though she quickly brushed it aside. It was easy to see how the hardships of the land could breed superstitions and fear, especially in a town like Redemption, where every person's survival depended on their strength and resilience. "Do you think it's true?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. He looked at her, his eyes narrowing. "Some do, some don't. But I'd say there's been enough tragedy in these parts to make a body wonder. Folks don't like to talk about it, but it's there, right under the surface. The scars run deep, Miss Harper. Maybe too deep." Charlotte studied the old man's face, seeing the weight of the years in the lines that etched his features. There was wisdom there, born from long experience in a town that had survived despite its secrets. She knew then that Amos Cartwright was a man who had seen things he wasn't ready to speak about. She straightened her shoulders, determined to keep her focus on what mattered. "Well, I'm not here to dwell on the past, Mr. Cartwright. I'm here to build a future." His lips twitched, as if he were fighting a smile. "That's the spirit. Maybe you'll be the one to change things around here. Lord knows we could use a bit of that." As he turned to leave, he paused for a moment, casting one last glance at the schoolhouse. "Just keep your eyes open, Miss Harper, and take care of those kids. The town might need more than just a teacher." Charlotte watched him go, his figure slowly disappearing into the dusty street. She felt the weight of his words settle on her shoulders, but she refused to let them sway her. Redemption may have its secrets, but she wasn't afraid. She had come to make a difference, and no dark whispers would change that. The future, she thought, was in her hands, and she would not let it slip away. The general store in Redemption was a small, cramped building filled with the smells of cured meats, fresh bread, and the musty scent of old wood. Shelves stocked with everything from bolts of cloth to jars of pickled vegetables lined the walls, and the air was thick with the chatter of townsfolk going about their business. Charlotte Harper had come to purchase a few essentials for her modest cabin and to gather more information about her new home, but as she stepped through the door she found herself surrounded by hushed voices and wary glances. The bell above the door jingled as it swung shut behind her, and she greeted the elderly shopkeeper with a friendly smile. Mrs. McAllister was a woman of few words, but her eyes softened when they met Charlotte's. "Good afternoon, Miss Harper," she said with a polite nod, her wrinkled hands working steadily to fold a piece of brown paper over a small bundle of sugar. "Afternoon, Mrs. McAllister," Charlotte replied, her gaze drifting over the shelves as she casually browsed. She picked up a jar of honey, her fingers brushing lightly over the lid as she tried to ignore the quiet murmur of conversation around her. As it didn't take long for her to realize that the whispers in the store were not of the usual fare. Trivial matters like the weather or the latest gossip about who had fallen ill or who was courting whom. No, these whispers had a different tone, one laced with unease and fear. "Heard he was spotted just north of town. Don't think he's here for anything good. Don't know if it's him, but a man fitting his description showed up 2 days ago. Big fellow, scarred face, wearing all black, Jack. An outlaw, and her curiosity piqued despite herself. She had heard of the infamous Jesse Blackjack McCall. The name had come up in a few hushed conversations during her first days in town, always spoken with a mixture of fear and disdain. The man was known as a dangerous figure, one whose reputation stretched far beyond the borders of Redemption. But as with all rumours, the truth was elusive, and Charlotte had dismissed it as the exaggerated tales of a town that lived on stories as much as it did on the land. But now, in the quiet of the general store, it seemed the rumours were more than just idle talk. "If it's him, we're all in trouble. That man doesn't leave a trail of blood for nothing. I'd keep my doors locked tight at night if I were you, Mrs. McAllister. The last thing we need is another outlaw coming through here like the last one did." The words settled over Charlotte like a heavy fog, clinging to her thoughts as she placed the jar of honey back on the shelf. She didn't have to look to know that the patrons were eyeing one another nervously, exchanging furtive glances over the tops of their hats. It was as if the town were holding its collective breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. She turned to Mrs. McAllister, her voice light but carrying an edge of concern. "Do you know anything about this man?" The older woman paused, her hands stilling as she placed a bundle of flour onto the counter. Her eyes flickered toward the back of the store, as if making sure no one was listening too closely. "Not much, Miss Harper, only that he's dangerous, and I'd be careful if I were you. Folks around here don't like to talk about it, but I reckon they're scared. That name, Black Jack, it's like a curse. I wouldn't want to be caught alone out there when he's around." Charlotte nodded, though the unease that had settled deep in her stomach wasn't easily dismissed. It wasn't just the name that troubled her. It was the way the whole town seemed to be holding its breath, as though they were waiting for the worst to happen. She had come to Redemption with the intention of helping, of building a better future for the children in the schoolhouse. But now the weight of the town's secrets pressed down on her. "Thank you, Mrs. McAllister," she said, giving the older woman a polite smile as she turned to leave. The store had grown suddenly quiet, the murmurs of conversation halting as Charlotte made her way toward the door. Outside, the sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the dusty streets. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of the earth with it, and Charlotte pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders as she stepped into the cool evening air. She glanced down the main street, her eyes scanning the quiet buildings, each one holding its own secrets. Redemption seemed still, its pulse slow and steady, but beneath the calm surface there was something else, something hidden. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had stumbled into something far more dangerous than a mere town with its share of hardship. The whispers of Black Jack and his dangerous reputation had unsettled her, but it was more than that. It was the way the town seemed to hold itself apart, as though it were on the edge of something much darker, something that had been buried beneath years of hardship, only now beginning to surface. Charlotte shook her head, trying to clear the fog that clouded her thoughts. She had come to Redemption to build something lasting and good, and she wouldn't let the rumors of an outlaw stop her, not now. But as the last of the daylight faded into the horizon, she couldn't help but wonder just how much danger lurked in the shadows of this town, waiting for the right moment to strike. As she made her way back to her cabin, her mind wandered, tracing the events of the day. Her thoughts were full of dreams of the schoolhouse, of lessons to be taught, and of the children who would someday fill the empty seats. But even as she made plans for tomorrow, a deeper, unspoken worry gnawed at her. She had yet to understand the full story of Redemption, and there was a part of her that feared she might not like what she would find. The wind whispered in her ears, carrying with it the hint of something darker on the horizon. The wind kicked up dust in lazy spirals as Jesse McCall rode into the outskirts of Redemption. His horse's hooves thudded steadily against the dry earth, the rhythmic sound a soft counterpoint to the quiet that surrounded him. The late afternoon sun beat down on him from a cloudless sky, its harsh light catching the weathered lines of his face, accentuating the deep creases around his mouth and the tiredness in his eyes. Jesse was a man carved from the land, a product of its unforgiving nature, with the kind of face that had seen things most men could never dream of, things that were better left forgotten. His dark hair, unkempt and falling over his forehead, held streaks of grey, just as his beard had begun to turn thick and coarse. His eyes, once as sharp as a hawk's, were now dulled with the burden of years spent fighting battles, both outward and inward. The scar that ran down his cheek was a constant reminder of the life he'd chosen, one that had left him with more regrets than he cared to count. As he guided his horse toward the small grove of trees near the edge of town, Jesse felt the familiar ache in his chest, the kind that had settled there long ago, like a weight that no amount of distance could relieve. Redemption. It was a town that was both too small and too big for him, too small in the way that it would swallow him whole if he let it, and too big in the way that he could hide in it and never be seen. Neither one appealed to him, but he'd come anyway. He was searching for something, even if he wasn't sure what it was. Maybe peace, maybe a way to undo some of the damage that followed him like a dark cloud, or maybe just a place where he wouldn't be judged for what he'd done. He pulled his horse to a halt beneath a tree and dismounted, feeling the familiar tension in his muscles as his boots hit the ground. His fingers brushed against the rough leather of his saddle, as if searching for something to hold on to, something solid. His hand tightened, but there was nothing there. No escape from the man he had become. Jesse ran a hand over his jaw, the rasp of his stubble rough against his skin, and let out a breath that had been lodged in his chest for too long. He gazed down the long, winding road that led into town, the setting sun casting long, stretching shadows across the land. It was a sight he'd seen 1,000 times before, but it never failed to remind him of the emptiness that lay ahead. Redemption had its hold on him, and it wasn't going to let go easily. The past had a way of creeping up on a man like a slow-burning fire, and Jesse was no stranger to its bite. His thoughts drifted back, as they often did, to the days when he had first donned the name Blackjack. The name had been whispered in saloons and feared in back alleys. It had become a brand, searing itself into his flesh and soul until there was no distinction between the man he had been and the man he had become. He had been reckless, wild, full of fire and hunger for things he couldn't name. Back then the world had been a game, and he had been the one holding all the cards. But the cards had turned on him, just as they always did. He had lost too many friends, too much blood, and too many pieces of himself to even recognize the man who rode into town today. "You're too good for this life, Jesse," his mother's voice echoed in his mind, as it always did when he thought of her. "You're better than this." He hadn't believed her then. But now, in the silence of the fading daylight, the words held more weight than they ever had before. They were a reminder of the choices he had made and the cost of those choices. There had been a time when he could justify his actions, when he believed in the righteousness of his rebellion, but as the years wore on and the faces of the dead haunted his dreams, Jesse had learned that the world didn't work that way. There was no such thing as redemption in the eyes of the law, only in the heart of a man who was brave enough to look at himself and ask if he could change. But change was a dangerous thing. A man could lose himself in the trying. Jesse closed his eyes and let the wind wash over him, feeling the sting of his regret cut through him like a blade. The past was never far, never something that could be outrun. It left behind a trail of ruin, of betrayal, of bloodshed, of promises broken, and there was no way to erase that, not here, not anywhere. He could run until his boots wore through, but the memories would follow him, relentless, like shadows that never let go. The soft neigh of his horse brought him back to the present, and he turned to look at the animal, steady and calm, as if it too was waiting for something. The town was just ahead, its dusty streets quiet beneath the fading sunlight. He could already hear the murmurs of the locals, their suspicions thick in the air. They had heard his name before. They knew who he was, even if they didn't want to. Redemption had a way of holding its secrets close, but it didn't take much to figure out the truth about a man like Jesse McCall. And Jesse knew better than to believe that people ever truly forgave a man like him. They might pretend, might offer him a place in their town, but they would never forget the name Black Jack. He turned his horse toward the town, his gaze narrowing as he squinted into the dimming horizon. There were plenty of places he could go, plenty of towns he could disappear into, but something about redemption gnawed at him, called to him in a way that he couldn't understand. Maybe it was the promise of something new, or maybe it was the need to prove to himself that he wasn't entirely lost, that there was still a chance for him to find the man his mother had always believed he could be. But the wind whispered its warnings, and Jesse knew that finding peace wouldn't come easy. The path ahead was tangled, and he wasn't sure he was ready to face whatever awaited him in that dusty little town. As he rode closer, his heart beat heavy in his chest, a quiet thud that seemed to echo the way the town's secrets whispered in the breeze. Redemption might have a place for him, but it would never forgive him for what he had been. And Jesse wasn't sure he could forgive himself either. Chapter 2, The Saloon Murmur. The low murmur of voices mixed with the steady clink of glasses and the soft shuffle of boots on the wooden floor as Jesse McCall stepped into the saloon. His boots echoed against the worn planks, a sound that seemed too loud for the quiet evening. The air inside was thick with smoke, the haze curling up toward the dim light of the lanterns that swung above, casting long shadows over the patrons hunched over their drinks. The smell of whiskey, sweat, and cheap tobacco filled his nostrils as his gaze swept over the room, taking in the familiar sights of a frontier saloon. Rough-hewn men in weathered coats, women with painted smiles, and the occasional sound of a piano in the corner, its keys clinking out a mournful tune. But it was the way the room fell silent when he entered that caught his attention. The change was subtle at first, the conversations around him slowing to a halt, the eyes of the men and women shifting toward him with barely concealed wariness. They didn't need to speak. It was in their eyes. Jesse McCall, outlaw and ghost of the past, had entered their sanctuary, and for a moment the very air seemed to hold its breath. He hadn't been in Redemption long, but he already knew the weight of his reputation. It had a way of walking in ahead of him, a shadow that preceded him wherever he went. Some of these people had heard the whispers of a man who had lived on the edge of the law, who had bled and fought for the kind of freedom that only outlaws understood. They had heard the stories of his ruthless past, the blood he'd spilled, and the wreckage left behind in his wake. But they also knew of the man who had ridden into town in search of something else. Redemption. A man who had shed the skin of his past, or so the rumors went. Still, there was fear in the air, a palpable tension that filled the space between the walls and the worn tables, wrapping itself around the patrons like a thick fog. Some of them feared him. Others, though, there was a different look in their eyes. Respect, or perhaps even admiration, for Jesse McCall had fought and survived when others had fallen. He had faced death more times than he cared to count, and it was clear that not everyone in this town was quite sure what to make of him. The legend of Blackjack McCall was still alive in the hearts of men like these, no matter how hard he tried to bury it. The bartender, a thick-set man with greying hair and a face carved from years of hard living, paused when Jesse approached the counter. He didn't speak at first, only gave him a curt nod. The tension hung heavy in the air, the soft clink of the bottle as it was set down, the hiss of the pouring whiskey, the sound of it all louder than it needed to be. "Whiskey?" Jesse muttered, his voice low and gravelly, the weight of it carrying more than just the demand for a drink. The bartender slid the glass toward him without a word, his eyes flicking nervously to the other patrons. Jesse didn't bother looking at them. He didn't need to. He could feel the weight of their gazes on the back of his neck, could sense the way their conversations had shifted, the way they now spoke in hushed tones when they thought he wasn't listening. "I hear old Blackjack's back in town." A voice came from behind him. It was a low, drawling voice that held a mixture of curiosity and contempt, like a snake waiting to strike. "I reckon he's come to settle some unfinished business." Jesse's hand froze mid-reach for his glass, the familiar weight of his old name settling like an old, unwanted coat. He'd hoped the rumors had died down, that Redemption was big enough to bury his past, but he knew better. There was no escaping the trail he'd left behind. He turned slowly, his gaze meeting the eyes of a man seated near the corner, a man who looked as if he belonged more to the shadows than to the light. His sharp eyes gleamed with suspicion, his jaw tight, and his lips drawn into a thin, disapproving line. There was a tension in the man's posture, one of someone who had seen too much of the world to trust easily. "You got a problem with me?" Jesse's voice was cold, the words rolling off his tongue with the force of a threat, but not without restraint. He didn't want to fight. Not tonight, not with the ghosts of his past clawing at him, but the man had a look in his eyes that made Jesse's fingers twitch toward the revolver at his hip. The man's gaze flickered to Jesse's side, the movement subtle but telling. He knew who Jesse was, knew the kind of man he was, and the tension between them thickened. Jesse could feel the anger swirling beneath the surface of the man's composed demeanor, and he could see the doubt in his eyes. The town may have been ready to let him settle here, but some people would never forgive the man who had once been feared by every lawman within 100 miles. "No problem, not yet," the man said, his tone dripping with a false politeness. He looked Jesse up and down with a sneer. "But a man like you, a man with a name like Blackjack, there's no tellin' what kind of trouble you'll stir up." Jesse set his glass down slowly, his eyes narrowing. He could feel the weight of the past pushing in on him, the old rage, the anger that had once been his constant companion. But tonight it wasn't the fight he wanted, not with this man. He had bigger battles to face. "Don't mistake me for what I was," Jesse replied, his voice firm, though the words felt heavy in his chest. "I'm not that man anymore." The man didn't respond immediately, his eyes scanning Jesse's face for the truth in his words. But there was no truth in Jesse's words. Not completely. Not yet. Redemption wasn't something a man earned overnight, and Jesse knew that better than anyone. His past was like a shadow that stretched across the town, no matter how much daylight he tried to let in. The man finally leaned back, his eyes still fixed on Jesse with a mixture of skepticism and distrust. "I'll be watching you, McCall. I reckon the town will too." Jesse gave a slight nod, the weight of the man's warning lingering in the air between them. He didn't say another word. He couldn't afford to. Redemption had a long memory, and it was still waiting for him to prove himself. As the man turned away, the noise of the saloon swelled again, the hum of conversation slowly picking up where it had left off. But it wasn't the same. The murmur had changed. There was a heaviness in the air now, a palpable shift in the room, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Jesse took a long sip of his whiskey, letting the burn of it settle in his chest, and he tried to ignore the whispers that circled him like vultures, the rumors of the outlaw who had come to seek redemption, and the town that wasn't sure it could trust him. The past wasn't something you could outrun. Jesse knew that better than anyone, but it was a fight he was willing to face head-on, one way or another. The night was thick with silence, the kind that settled over the town like a heavy blanket, muffling the sounds of the world outside. The dim light from the lanterns flickered in the corner of the saloon, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the walls, holding the room in a quiet, restless embrace. Jesse McCall sat alone at a worn table in the farthest corner, his back to the wall, his gaze distant and fixed on nothing in particular. The murmur of voices around him faded into the background, as though the world itself had decided to give him a moment of solitude. Something he rarely allowed himself. His fingers curled around the glass of whiskey in front of him, the amber liquid swirling lazily in the dim light. And he didn't drink for the pleasure of it any more. He drank to quiet the noise in his mind, to drown out the memories of the things he'd done, the lives he'd ruined, and the reputation that had clung to him like a curse. The man he had been was a shadow that still followed him, no matter how far he rode, no matter how many miles he put between himself and his past. He could feel the weight of it, the heavy burden that sat squarely on his chest, suffocating him with every breath. The name Blackjack was more than just a title. It was a brand, a mark of his sins, and it was a part of him that he couldn't outrun. And yet, despite the weight of that shadow, despite the violent life he had lived, Jesse couldn't ignore the gnawing ache inside of him, the part of him that wanted, no, needed something more. He wanted peace. The thought had been with him for a long time now, lurking in the corners of his mind. It wasn't a fleeting fancy or some romantic notion about a new life in a quiet town. No, this was something deeper, something he couldn't shake. Redemption had become more than just a place. It had become his last chance. If he stayed here long enough, if he fought hard enough, maybe he could prove to himself that he wasn't the man he had been. Maybe he could find a way to be something more than the outlaw, the gunfighter, the murderer. He didn't know how or even where to begin, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't keep running from who he was. The saloon was warm, but the weight on his shoulders felt cold. It was the kind of cold that settled deep in his bones, the kind that no amount of whiskey could thaw. He stared into his glass, watching the reflections of the lantern light dance on the surface, and a single thought rose up, clear and unshakable. I have to change. But how? The question lingered, unanswered, and Jesse let out a slow, resigned sigh. He wasn't a fool. He knew what people thought of him. He knew that no amount of good deeds could erase the trail of violence he had left behind. He had a reputation, and it was a dangerous thing. But the need to escape it, to step away from the shadow that had dogged him for so long, had grown stronger with each passing day. He wasn't the same man who had once ridden through towns with a gun in his hand and revenge in his heart. That man was dead, buried in the dust, along with the friends and enemies he had left behind. Jesse's hand tightened around the glass, and he took a long, deliberate drink, the burn of the whiskey sliding down his throat like fire. As the warmth spread through him, a strange calm settled over him, a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in years. He had a plan, though it was a dangerous one, the kind of plan that could either save him or destroy him. But he had no choice. There was no other way. He had to be seen, not as Black Jack McCall, but as Jesse McCall, the man he could become, if only the world would let him. And to do that, he would need to prove himself, not with guns or threats, but with something far more difficult: respect. It was a simple idea, but it felt as impossible as climbing the tallest mountain. Redemption would never accept him until they saw that he was more than his past. He would need to show them, show everyone, that he was capable of something other than violence, that he could contribute to this town, that he could be trusted. The question remained, how? The answer came to him slowly, like a faint whisper on the wind: marriage. The thought hit him with the force of a lightning bolt, and for a moment he simply sat there, stunned by the audacity of it. A marriage of convenience. It wasn't a romantic notion, not by any means, but it was a solution. A way to show redemption that he could settle down, that he could play by their rules. It would give him legitimacy, and in a town like this, legitimacy was everything. Jesse's eyes narrowed as he mulled the idea over in his mind. He knew who could help him. He knew a woman who had come to this town with nothing but hope and a determination to make a difference. Charlotte Harper. She was new to the town, and though she might not be familiar with his reputation, she would be more than capable of seeing the practicality of such an arrangement. She had come to teach, to change lives, to build a future for these children, and Jesse needed her help to build his own future. The idea was reckless, absurd even, but it was the only idea he had. He couldn't do this alone. He would need someone who was strong, someone who understood the value of reputation and survival, and Charlotte was the kind of woman who might understand that better than anyone. She had the fire in her eyes, the kind of fire that could ignite something within him if he allowed it. Jesse stood slowly, the decision forming inside of him like the calm before a storm. He wasn't proud of the man he had been, and he wasn't foolish enough to think that a marriage, even one born of convenience, would solve everything. But it was a start. It was his chance to prove that he could be more than the name that haunted him, more than the man who had burned so many bridges. He left the saloon with a sense of quiet resolve, the weight of his decision settling over him like a heavy cloak. It wasn't the path he would have chosen, but it was the only one that offered him a way out. He didn't know what would come of it, or if Charlotte would even consider his proposal, but one thing was certain: this was the only chance he had left, and Jesse McCall wasn't the kind of man to back down when there was a chance for redemption. The sound of Charlotte's voice echoed softly within the four walls of the schoolhouse, the familiar rhythm of her lesson rising and falling as she spoke to her small class of eager children. The sun filtered in through the tall windows, casting golden light across the worn desks and faded walls. She was beginning to feel at home in this small space, a world away from the harshness of the frontier, a place where she could weave a tapestry of learning and possibility for these children. It was the one thing she could hold on to, the promise she had made to herself before arriving in redemption. But that afternoon, as she stood by the chalkboard explaining the rules of arithmetic, she felt a sudden shift in the air, a subtle tension that swept through the room as the door swung open. Charlotte turned, startled, her chalk poised in midair. The children froze, their wide eyes darting toward the entrance. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright sunlight outside, was a man. Tall and broad-shouldered, he filled the frame of the door with a presence that seemed both commanding and wary, as if he were accustomed to standing alone in a world that never quite accepted him. His face was a map of hard years, weathered, scarred with a ruggedness that spoke of a life lived on the edge of the law. His dark eyes scanned the room quickly, but it was clear that he wasn't here to observe the lesson. He had come for something else. Charlotte's heart skipped a beat, her instincts alert as she assessed the man in front of her. His clothes were worn but functional, a duster coat hanging loosely over his shoulders, and a gun belt settled low on his hips, the outline of a revolver unmistakable. There was no mistaking the danger that clung to him like a shadow. "Can I help you?" Charlotte asked, her voice calm but firm, the words leaving her mouth without hesitation. She had dealt with all manner of people in her short time here, but something about this man made her gut tighten. She wasn't sure if it was the way he carried himself or the silent warning in the air, but there was no denying the tension between them. He hesitated for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. "I'm just looking for a place to sit for a spell," he said gruffly, his voice low and rough, as if it had been worn down by years of disuse. Charlotte felt the weight of his words settle over her, and for a moment she wasn't sure if he meant to be rude or simply didn't know how to speak any other way. But his presence was undeniable, like a storm cloud on the horizon, unpredictable and ominous. She took a step forward, her posture straightening as she held his gaze. "This is a schoolhouse, not a place for loitering," she said, her tone measured but assertive. "If you're looking for something specific, I suggest you go into town." The man raised an eyebrow at her, the corners of his mouth twitching, though it wasn't quite a smile. "I'm not loitering, ma'am," he said, his voice deepening with a hint of humour. "Just passing through, but if it's a problem, I can leave." Charlotte stood her ground, unwilling to let him intimidate her. She could feel the weight of his scrutiny, but she didn't back down. "I don't mind company, but I'm afraid I have lessons to teach," she said, her voice softening just a fraction. "Perhaps we could talk later, after school hours?" Jesse McCall seemed to consider her words for a long moment, his gaze flickering over her with something like curiosity, before he nodded, stepping back toward the door. "Fair enough," he muttered, as if she had just won some silent contest between them. He didn't seem pleased, but he didn't protest. Instead, he turned, the heavy thud of his boots sounding in the silence as he made his way out. Charlotte let out the breath she had been holding, her heart still racing. She had managed to maintain control, but the encounter had left her rattled. This was no ordinary man. This was Jesse McCall, the man whose reputation had already cast its shadow over the town, the man who had become a whispered legend, both feared and strangely admired. His presence in the schoolhouse had unsettled her, but she couldn't deny the pull she felt, an odd mixture of defiance and intrigue. Jesse McCall leaned against the side of the building, his hand resting casually on the gun belt at his side, his eyes narrowed as he watched the schoolhouse from a distance. The woman, Charlotte Harper, hadn't exactly welcomed him with open arms, but he had expected as much. A woman like her didn't belong in a place like this. She was too refined, too earnest, and she wore the kind of idealism on her sleeve that made him wary. He wasn't sure why he had stopped by the schoolhouse in the first place. He hadn't planned on walking in, not really. But something about the way she held herself, the way she didn't flinch at his presence, had pulled him in. The softness in her voice, the quiet strength in her stance, it was all so foreign to him, yet something about it had stirred something inside of him. He had thought, just for a moment, that perhaps she could be the one person who wouldn't look at him with disdain or suspicion. But then there it was, the coldness in her eyes, the polite but firm dismissal that reminded him exactly why he had spent so long being alone. People like her didn't understand men like him. They didn't understand that sometimes survival came at a cost, and some things could never be undone. His jaw clenched as he thought of his past, of the life he had left behind, and of the people who would never see him for anything more than the man who had once ridden with outlaws. He could feel the weight of it now pressing in on him, the shadow of his reputation too large to outrun, but as he stood there watching her through the window, something else flickered in his chest, something darker, something that stirred to life at the thought of proving her wrong. The challenge she had given him, even in the most polite terms, was more than just a refusal of his presence. It was a challenge to his very existence. She had no idea what kind of man she was dealing with, but Jesse McCall wasn't the kind of man who took kindly to being judged, especially by someone who had never seen the kind of world he had come from. The thought of proving her wrong stirred something inside him, something wild and untamed. He had made a vow to change, to find a way to make himself more than the man he had been. But that didn't mean he could simply forget who he was. He had his pride, and he would protect it, no matter how much he might need redemption. Their worlds had collided today, and Jesse knew this wouldn't be the last time. But whether they could ever truly understand each other, or find a way to work together, remained to be seen. Chapter 3. The Proposition. The small meeting hall in Redemption was hardly grand. The walls were bare, except for a few faded maps, a relic from a time when people hoped the town might grow. The floorboards creaked under the weight of the townsfolk who gathered there, their voices a quiet hum that blended with the low murmur of the wind outside. The long wooden table at the centre of the room was well worn, its edges chipped and stained from years of use. To some it was merely a place where business got done, where decisions were made, and where the future of Redemption was decided, little by little. But to Jesse McCall, who sat at the end of the table, this room felt like the last vestige of civilization. He was used to the wide open spaces of the frontier, where the horizon stretched out like a promise of freedom. But in this room, surrounded by people who had seen him for what he was, an outlaw, he knew that the only way to carve out a future for himself was to make a choice that would forever change the course of his life. Charlotte Harper had just entered the room, her footsteps light but firm, her eyes wary as she took in the sight of him sitting there, waiting. She paused by the door for a moment, and Jesse saw the subtle tightening of her jaw, the way her gaze flickered to the empty chair across from him. She had no idea what he was about to ask, but the tension in her posture told him that she could feel something stirring in the air between them. She took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving him as she crossed the room and took her seat, the rustle of her skirt the only sound in the stillness. Her fingers gripped the edge of the chair, her knuckles white from the force. Jesse noticed the slight tremor in her hand, the subtle unease in her gaze. She didn't trust him, that much was clear. And he couldn't blame her. "I assume you didn't bring me here just to watch the dust settle," she said, her voice steady, though there was an edge to it. "What is it you want, McCall?" Jesse leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, his eyes locked on hers. He had made his decision, and now there was no turning back. The weight of his reputation still hung over him, but there was something else too, a desperate need for change, for a new beginning, a future that didn't have to be defined by the man he had been. "I want a way out," he said, his voice low but firm. I've spent too long running from what I've done, from who I've been. I need a chance to start over, to prove that I'm more than just the name that's been following me like a shadow." Charlotte's brow furrowed slightly, her eyes narrowing as she watched him. "A chance? Is that all you want? You don't think you've earned it? You think a clean slate is something you can just ask for?" Her words stung, but Jessie didn't flinch. He had heard worse in his life, had been cast aside by men far worse than she could ever imagine. But Charlotte wasn't like the others. She wasn't interested in his past, and yet she couldn't ignore it either. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said, his voice steady now. "I'm asking for a chance to prove that I can be something else, something better." He hesitated, searching for the right words. "I need a way to show this town that I can be more than just the man I was." Charlotte crossed her arms, her lips pressed tightly together as she stared at him. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words, with fears, with doubts. Jessie could feel her weighing his words, the caution in her gaze making it clear that she wasn't about to take him at face value. And he didn't blame her, he wasn't sure he would either, but this was the only way, the only chance he had left. "I'm offering you a proposition," he said, slowly, watching her carefully. A marriage of convenience." Charlotte blinked, as if she hadn't heard him correctly. "A marriage?" she echoed, her voice a mixture of disbelief and confusion. "Are you serious? Do you think I'm some kind of fool?" Jessie straightened, his gaze unwavering. "It's the only way I see out of this," he said, his voice quiet but intense. "You've come to redemption to build something. You want to make a difference, and I want to make a difference too. I can help you. I can protect you, give you stability in a town that doesn't know the meaning of the word. In return, you'll give me the legitimacy I need. You'll give me a chance to be more than just the name that people whisper about." Charlotte shook her head, her voice a low murmur. "And what do you expect in return, McCall? A few nights of companionship? A quiet house and a little respect from the townsfolk? Do you think I'm so desperate?" Jessie's jaw tightened. "I'm not asking for more than what you're willing to give. We both have something to gain here. You need protection from the people who would tear down everything you're trying to build. And I need a way to be seen as someone who can contribute, someone who isn't a threat. We can help each other." For a moment there was silence, the weight of his words hanging in the air between them. Charlotte's gaze dropped to the table, her fingers tracing the grain of the wood as she considered what he had said. Jessie could almost see the struggle inside her, the part of her that wanted to believe that there was more to him than his reputation, and the part of her that knew the cost of trusting someone like him. Finally she looked up, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of indignation and hope. "You're asking me to risk everything I've worked for," she said softly, the tremor in her voice betraying the raw emotion beneath the words. "To bind myself to a man who has no claim to anything but a past full of mistakes? You're asking me to put my faith in you, and in this absurd arrangement." Jessie leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle but insistent. "I know it's a risk, but sometimes the biggest risk is the only one worth taking." His eyes softened just slightly, the weight of the man he had been beginning to shift into something else. "I won't ask you to do this if you don't want to, but I can't do it alone. I need you, Charlotte, and I'm asking you to take that chance with me." For a long moment Charlotte said nothing. Her eyes searched his, reading the quiet sincerity in his gaze, the way his words had shifted from demand to pleading. He was asking for her trust, not just for a partnership, but for something deeper. She knew it was foolish. She knew it could be dangerous. But there was a flicker inside her that told her this could be the beginning of something neither of them had expected. Finally, with a heavy sigh, Charlotte nodded, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I'll consider it," she said, the words feeling like a weight lifted. "But know this, Jessie McCall. I won't do this out of pity. I'll do it because I believe there's something in you worth saving." Jessie's heart tightened at her words, and for the first time in a long while he allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, There was a way out of the shadows. The quiet hum of the town had settled into a calm that Charlotte had learned to appreciate, though it never quite masked the unease that lingered just beneath the surface. Redemption was a place full of contradictions. On one hand, it seemed to pulse with the promise of progress, the kind of slow but sure change that could make a difference. On the other, it was a town full of ghosts, whispers of a violent past and the weight of sins that would never truly be forgotten. Charlotte walked down the dirt road toward her schoolhouse, the sun low in the sky, casting long shadows on the town that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. She had made her decision, had committed herself to a future that, though uncertain, seemed like the only path that made sense in this town where everything else felt so fragile. Their conversation had lingered in her mind long after he had left the meeting hall, the weight of his proposal sitting heavy in her chest. He had asked for her help, for her faith in him, and she had agreed, tentatively, cautiously, but she had agreed nonetheless. And now, as she walked toward the school, her mind spun with 100 different thoughts, 100 different questions she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Could she really do this? Could she trust him, a man with so much darkness in his past, to uphold his end of the bargain, to protect her, and more importantly to protect the children and the future she was trying to build in this town? She had her doubts, but the town was fragile, and the need for protection was very real. The men who had watched Jessie walk into that saloon the other day, she could see it in their eyes. They wouldn't give up their suspicions, their fears, so easily. And as long as the people of Redemption saw her as an outsider, as a woman with no true stake in their survival, her school would always be at risk. The thought of it unsettled her. She had come to Redemption to change lives, to offer something more than survival, to offer hope. But she knew, deep down, that hope was not something that would come easily. Not here, not now. And that was where Jessie came in. Her breath caught as she reached the schoolhouse, her fingers brushing against the worn handle of the door. He had given her the only way she saw to protect the future she had dreamed of, to keep the school open, to safeguard the children who would be the next generation of this town. But in accepting his offer, in tying herself to a man like him, she was giving up something more than just her independence. She was agreeing to an arrangement that was, at best, a partnership of necessity, at worst a compromise of her ideals. Charlotte's fingers tightened around the doorknob. She had always prided herself on standing firm in her beliefs, on believing that people could change, that they could find redemption. But could she really extend that grace to someone like Jessie McCall, someone whose very name was a symbol of the violence and chaos she had always fought against? Jessie sat at the edge of the small cabin he had rented, the low fire crackling in the hearth as he stared into the flames. The shadows danced across the walls, flickering with the same restlessness he felt in his chest. It was a feeling that never seemed to leave him, a constant companion that gnawed at his insides, reminding him of everything he had done, everything he had lost. The town of Redemption had offered him a chance, a fleeting one, to be sure, but a chance nonetheless, a chance to make something of himself, to prove that he wasn't the man the world thought he was. But even as the words had left his mouth, even as he had made his proposition to Charlotte Harper, a part of him had wondered whether he could really do it. Could he really change? Could he really become the man she believed he could be? Or was he forever destined to be the shadow that haunted this town, the man whose reputation would never let him escape the sins of his past? He had made the proposal because he saw no other way. He had no other means of securing legitimacy, no other way to make people see him for who he could be, not who he had been. The past had a hold on him, an iron grip that wouldn't loosen, no matter how hard he tried, and without the kind of protection a man like him needed, he wouldn't stand a chance in this town. But what did he expect in return? He wasn't asking for a partnership built on love or trust. He was asking for something practical, something that, in the harsh world of the frontier, was often the only thing that could keep a man alive. And that's what it came down to, survival. Jessie leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He didn't know what this union would look like, or if Charlotte would even accept him as her husband. But he knew one thing. Without her, without this alliance, he would never stand a chance of redemption. Not in this town. Not anywhere. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the last of the light faded from the sky as Charlotte sat at the worn desk in the schoolhouse, the faint sound of a distant coyote howling in the quiet night. The decision she had made was not an easy one. She had agreed to Jessie's proposition, to the promise of protection, to the idea of security, but she had agreed reluctantly, the weight of the unknown pressing against her heart. She had come here to teach, to create something new, something better. But she had never imagined that the price of that dream would be so high. She knew that Jessie needed this arrangement as much as she did, that his need for legitimacy was as strong as her need for protection. But in giving him her trust, however cautiously, she was also giving up something more precious. Her belief that she could make a difference without compromise. There was no going back from this. Their lives were intertwined now, for better or worse, in a way that neither of them had fully understood when they first spoke those words. The uneasy truce that had formed between them hung in the air, fragile and tentative. They were bound by necessity, not love, not trust, but something else, something raw. As Jessie lay in bed that night, his mind drifting in and out of sleep, he couldn't shake the sense of change that had begun to take root in both him and Charlotte. This union, this marriage of convenience, was as much about survival as it was about transformation. And perhaps, just perhaps, in the midst of their shared need, there could be something more than either of them had bargained for. But for now, they were bound by a fragile promise, a promise of safety, of protection, of a future that neither of them had dared to imagine. The seeds had been planted, and all that was left was to wait and see what would grow. The air was thick with anticipation as the small gathering of townsfolk took their seats inside the makeshift chapel. The building, once a humble town hall, was little more than a structure of timber and stone, weathered by time and the harsh winds that blew across the plains. Today, however, it seemed to hold a different energy, a sense of change that was as palpable as the dust settling in the corners of the room. The walls, which had long been bare, were now draped with simple white linens, the fabric fluttering gently in the draught. Fresh wild flowers, arranged in mismatched vases, dotted the windowsills, their colours bright against the faded wooden beams overhead. The floor beneath their feet was scuffed and worn, its rough planks holding the weight of generations past, but today it would bear witness to something new, a marriage. A union formed not of love, but of necessity. Jessie McCall stood at the front of the room, his posture rigid as he waited. He was dressed in the finest clothes he could afford, worn but clean, his shirt freshly pressed. His boots, polished only slightly, reflected the low light that filtered through the windows. He could feel the weight of the eyes upon him, the whispers, the judgment. The townsfolk had gathered here not just to witness the ceremony, but to watch him take this step, one that they all knew would either redeem him or cement his place as the town's most notorious outcast. Charlotte Harper stood beside him, her hands trembling ever so slightly as she smoothed the fabric of her dress. It was a simple gown, plain but practical, with a modest cut that suited her perfectly. She had no desire for grand ceremony, no longing for finery. This wasn't about her, it wasn't about her dreams or the future she had envisioned for herself. It was about what had to be done. She had always believed in the power of education, of providing children with hope for a better life, and if this union could protect that, protect her school, then it was worth it. The room was filled with murmurs, the scent of nervous excitement mingling with the faint perfume of the wild flower. Some of the townsfolk whispered to one another, their voices low and cautious, their eyes darting toward the pair at the front of the room. It wasn't lost on anyone that the union of Jessie McCall an infamous outlaw, and Charlotte Harper, a woman whose ideals had only just begun to take root in this place, was unconventional to say the least. The townspeople had seen their fair share of marriages, but none quite like this. No one could deny the curiosity that swirled in the air, the whisperings of scandal, of disbelief, and of surprise. There were some who muttered under their breath that it was a foolish decision, a hasty choice. Others looked on with more hopeful eyes, wondering if this strange marriage could bring something new to redemption. As the town's justice of the peace stepped forward to begin the ceremony, the room fell into a hush. His voice was calm and authoritative, the words he spoke simple and to the point, but there was an undeniable weight behind them. The vows they would exchange, though formal and straightforward, carried the promise of something more. The contract that had been hastily drawn up, just a few lines written on a scrap of parchment, was read aloud, the ink still faint in places where it had been hurriedly signed. The words echoed in the room, each syllable carrying a weight that neither Charlotte nor Jessie could ignore. "I, Jessie McCall, take you, Charlotte Harper, as my wife, to protect and honor you, and to offer you the protection you seek in this town," the justice began, his voice reverberating through the wooden beams. Charlotte's heart skipped a beat as she heard the words. They weren't what she had imagined when she had first dreamed of her future, but they were what she needed, what the town needed. A man who could protect her school, who could offer her the security she couldn't provide on her own. "Charlotte Harper, take you, Jessie McCall, as my husband, to offer you the legitimacy you seek, to stand with you in this town, to build a future together, whatever that may look like," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling in her chest. She didn't know what the future held for them, but she had made a promise, to herself and to the children in her school, that she would not let fear stop her from doing what needed to be done. There was no passion in the exchange, no grand gestures of affection, but there was something else, something deeper, a quiet recognition of the necessity of this union. They were bound by the circumstances of their lives, by the need to survive, to protect, to build, and in that moment they both knew that this marriage, however unconventional, was their only way forward. As the justice of the peace pronounced them man and wife, the room remained still for a moment, as if the very air was holding its breath. There were no cheers, no applause, just the soft shuffle of boots on the wooden floor and the quiet murmur of a few voices exchanging their opinions in low, conspiratorial tones. Charlotte felt a strange mixture of relief and uncertainty wash over her. The ceremony was done, the promise was made, but what now? What would this partnership look like once the ceremony was over and the reality of their new life together began to sink in? Jessie stood beside her, his jaw clenched, his gaze steady. She could feel the tension in his posture, the weight of his own thoughts pressing down on him. They had made the right choice, both of them, she knew that, and yet there was a part of her, an unsure, uneasy part, that wondered if they had truly understood what they had just agreed to. As the crowd began to disperse, some offering quick nods of congratulations and others lingering in whispered conversation, Charlotte couldn't help but steal a glance at Jessie. He stood there, tall and rigid, his face unreadable, his eyes still clouded with the past. He hadn't spoken since the vows had been exchanged, and Charlotte wasn't sure if he even knew what to say. She didn't know either. There were no grand words, no promises of love or devotion. There was only the weight of necessity and the fragile hope that something, anything, would grow from the seeds they had planted today. Their first steps as husband and wife were taken in silence, the world outside the chapel still holding its breath. There were no fireworks, no moments of passionate declaration, only the steady sound of footsteps on the dust, the soft rustle of Charlotte's dress, and the quiet realization that their lives, though forged in the heat of necessity, were now irrevocably tied together. And in that silence, in the quiet space between their steps, there was the faintest glimmer of something else, something that neither of them could name yet, but something that might just grow, in time, from the unspoken promise they had made. Chapter 4. Aftermath of the Union. The room above the town's boarding house was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from the soft glow of a single lamp perched on a wooden nightstand. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath their feet. The evening had settled over the town like a blanket, cool and still, the weight of the day's events hanging heavily in the air. Charlotte stood by the window, her back to Jessie, as she gazed out at the flickering lights of the town below. The streets were quieter now, the usual bustle of the day giving way to the peaceful rhythm of the evening. She could hear the faint murmur of voices from the boarding house downstairs, the soft hum of conversation that felt miles away from the turmoil in her chest. She hadn't known what to expect after the ceremony, hadn't known how she would feel. But now, standing here in this small, modest room, she found that the only thing she could feel was the weight of the decision they had just made. She had agreed to marry Jessie McCall, and now here they were, husband and wife. The words still seemed foreign on her lips, an echo of the vows that had been exchanged with all the formality of a business transaction. Her gaze flickered to Jessie, who stood across the room, his shoulders squared, his hands resting at his sides as if bracing himself for something. His eyes were dark, unreadable, his face still etched with the lines of a man who had spent too many years living with the weight of regret. He hadn't spoken since the ceremony, and now, as the quiet stretched between them, Charlotte couldn't help but wonder what thoughts were running through his mind. It was an awkward kind of silence, the kind that spoke of uncertainty, of things unsaid, of two people trying to make sense of a decision that had been made for reasons far beyond anything either of them had anticipated. The weight of their union, their forced partnership, was something they both felt, the knowledge that this was a beginning, but one that was not born from love or affection, but from necessity. Charlotte let out a slow breath, turning away from the window. "Well," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "this is certainly not what I expected." Jessie shifted his weight, his gaze flickering toward her but not quite meeting her eyes. "Neither did I," he muttered, his voice low and rough, as if the words themselves were difficult to find. The tension between them was palpable, like a thread stretched too tight, ready to snap at any moment. Neither of them had ever imagined that this would be how their lives would intersect. Marriage, yes, but not this kind of marriage, not one forged in the fire of necessity and survival. It had never been part of the plan for either of them. Charlotte's fingers curled into the fabric of her dress, and she hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I never thought it would come to this, you know." She glanced up at him, her eyes searching his face for something, some sign of understanding, some glimmer of the man he could be. "I never thought I'd be married to someone like you." Jessie met her gaze then, his eyes steady though they held a depth of emotion that he hadn't let slip since the ceremony. "And I never thought I'd be married to someone like you either," he said quietly, the weight of his words settling between them like a quiet confession. "But here we are." Charlotte nodded, her gaze dropping to the floor as the silence returned, thick and heavy. She didn't know what to say next. The truth was, she wasn't sure what to feel. She had entered into this arrangement to protect the school, to protect the children she had sworn to care for. But now, standing here in the aftermath, she realized that she hadn't fully understood the gravity of what she had agreed to. Her eyes flickered to the bed in the corner, its simple frame and unadorned blankets a quiet reminder of the life they were about to begin together. It wasn't a life she had envisioned, not by any means, but it was one she had chosen. She had chosen it out of duty, out of necessity, and perhaps, just perhaps, out of a flicker of hope. Jessie cleared his throat, his voice breaking the silence once more. "I know this isn't what you wanted, Charlotte. I know it wasn't part of your plan." He paused, his gaze softening for a moment as he looked at her, the weight of his own internal battle evident in the lines of his face. "But I'll do my best to keep my end of the bargain. I'll protect you, I'll protect your school, and I'll do whatever it takes to make this work." Charlotte looked at him then, her breath catching in her throat. There was something in his words, something raw and genuine that made her heart flutter unexpectedly. He wasn't offering her a grand love story or promises of devotion. He was offering something far simpler, far more real. A chance at survival, at stability, at the possibility of something more. "I don't expect love," she said softly, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "I never expected that. But I hoped for respect. I hoped for a partnership. And that's what I need, for both of us." Jesse nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Respect," he echoed. "I can give you that." It wasn't much, but it was a start. It was the first step on a path neither of them had planned to walk, but one they would have to navigate together. There was no turning back now. As the evening settled in around them, the room grew darker, the shadows stretching longer across the walls. Charlotte sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap as she gathered her thoughts. Jesse, meanwhile, had walked to the window, his silhouette outlined by the dim light from the street below. Neither of them spoke for a long while, the silence now filled with the unspoken understanding that this marriage was not the end of their journey, it was merely the beginning. Outside, the world seemed to settle into the quiet of night, the stars bright above them, the world spinning forward, as it always had. But in that small room, beneath the weight of their new reality, both Charlotte and Jesse felt the tremors of change, of transformation taking root in the most unexpected of places. As the night deepened, so too did their understanding of the partnership they had forged. It was uneasy, uncertain, but it was also something neither of them could deny. The road ahead would be hard, filled with challenges they could not yet predict, but it was a road they would walk together, step by careful step, unaware of the tenderness and strength that would slowly grow between them in the quiet moments to come. The early morning light streamed through the small window, casting soft golden beams across the modest room. Charlotte Harper stood at the simple wooden table, her hands busy with papers as she organized the lessons for the day. The scent of fresh-brewed coffee lingered in the air, and the faint sound of birds chirping outside was a comforting reminder that the world was still despite the uncertainty that had defined her life since the marriage. Jesse McCall, however, was less at ease in this space, the awkwardness of their shared morning quiet evident as he moved about, trying not to disturb the delicate balance between them. He had been awake before her, his boots thudding softly against the floor as he began to tend to the small tasks of their homestead. He didn't know how to make himself useful in the schoolhouse, but the homestead, well, that was something he could handle. Repairing a broken fence, gathering firewood and clearing the yard seemed more in line with the man he had been than any academic lesson Charlotte might offer. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was intruding in a world he had never been a part of. "Can I help with anything?" he asked, his voice low and a little gruff as he looked toward her, his brow furrowed slightly in thought. It wasn't a question of eagerness so much as a desire to be useful, but there was a hesitance in his tone, an understanding that he wasn't quite sure where he fit into her world. Charlotte looked up from her papers, a slight smile tugging at the corner of her lips, despite the awkwardness of the moment. "You can set the table," she said, her voice warm but matter-of-fact. "Breakfast is nearly ready, and I think we could both use a little nourishment." He nodded, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face as he made his way to the small table where two mismatched plates sat waiting. Jesse's movements were deliberate but not graceful, the clink of the dishes ringing in the silence between them as he placed everything in its proper spot, though the arrangement was a little off-centre. Charlotte watched him for a moment, her fingers stilling on the paper in front of her as she took in the sight of him, a man who was, for all his rough exterior, trying to find his place in this strange new life they had created together. She opened her mouth to say something, but before she could, Jesse's elbow knocked the coffee cup she had set on the edge of the table, sending it tumbling to the floor in a soft crash. The porcelain shattered with a sharp sound, and for a moment both of them froze. Jesse's face flushed with embarrassment, his hands raised in a gesture of apology. "Sorry about that. Didn't mean to—" Charlotte couldn't help but laugh, a soft, genuine sound that seemed to break through the tension between them. "It's fine," she said, wiping away a stray tear of laughter. "I was just getting used to the cup anyway." Jessie, still standing by the table, let out a breath of relief, and for a brief moment there was a flicker of warmth in his gaze. "I'll clean it up," he muttered, kneeling down to gather the broken pieces. "You don't have to," Charlotte replied quickly, her voice still holding a note of mirth, "but thank you." Their eyes met, and in that brief moment something unspoken passed between them, a shared acknowledgement of the awkwardness that was slowly turning into something more comfortable. They weren't quite at ease with each other yet, but there was potential. After a few moments, Jessie looked up, holding the broom awkwardly in one hand. "Guess we should work on the breakfast too," he said, his tone hesitant, but there was a touch of humour in it now. Charlotte, still smiling, nodded and moved to the stove, relieved that their awkwardness hadn't lingered too long. "We'll figure it out," she said softly.
"One step at a time."
Later that morning, as the sun climbed higher into the sky, Charlotte stood at the front of the schoolhouse. A modest building now made more vibrant by the children's laughter and the colourful sketches that adorned the walls. The room, though small and humble, had become her sanctuary, a place where she could mould the minds of the children she had promised to care for. She had worked tirelessly to turn this space into something more than just four walls. It was a space for learning, for growth, for hope. Her voice was steady and clear as she began to address the students, her passion for education radiating from every word she spoke. "Remember, class, that the world is full of possibilities," she said, her eyes scanning the faces of the eager children. "It's up to you to decide how to shape your future." Her words were simple, but they carried weight, and she saw the way the children's eyes lit up in response. Even the skeptical ones, those who had been raised with the belief that the world was a harsh place that offered no second chances, couldn't help but be drawn in by her unwavering belief in their potential. Out of the corner of her eye, Charlotte saw a few of the townsfolk peeking in through the open door, watching from the sideline. There had been whispers when she first arrived, doubts about whether a woman from the East could ever truly understand life on the frontier. But now she could sense the shift in the room, the way the children's energy had begun to change, the way the adults, even the ones who had been skeptical, were starting to listen. Her heart swelled with quiet pride. She had known that her work wouldn't be easy, but she had never doubted the importance of what she was doing. Redemption needed hope, needed progress, and she was determined to give it to them. Elsewhere in town, Jesse McCall was doing what he did best, making his presence felt, but quietly, without fanfare. He had spent the morning making subtle repairs to the homes of a few of the more vulnerable families in town, fixing broken doors, mending fences, and offering his assistance without expecting anything in return. It wasn't the kind of work that brought attention, but Jesse had learned long ago that it wasn't always the loudest actions that made the most difference. As he walked down the street, his hands stained with wood and sweat, he noticed a few of the local men eyeing him from a distance, their expressions cautious but no longer filled with open hostility. He wasn't yet trusted, but the wall of suspicion had begun to soften, just slightly. One of the older men, a farmer who had been one of the most vocal skeptics when Jesse had first arrived in town, gave him a curt nod as he passed. Jesse returned the gesture with a simple nod of his own, the kind of acknowledgement that signalled that perhaps there might be something more between them than just the distrust of the past. He didn't need to prove anything to them, not yet, but in his own way he was earning their respect, one small act of kindness at a time. As he moved on, his eyes lingered on the schoolhouse in the distance, where Charlotte was still inside, her voice rising with the same passion that had first drawn him to her. He didn't understand everything about her, didn't yet know how he fit into her world, but he knew one thing: she was here to stay, and with her determination she was changing redemption, one small step at a time. Jesse had no illusions about the challenges they would face in the future, but he also knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, and that was more than either of them had expected when they first came to this town. The sun was beginning its descent, casting a warm golden light through the small kitchen window. Charlotte stood by the stove, her hands moving with practiced ease as she stirred the pot of stew. The savoury aroma filled the room, mingling with the earthy scent of freshly cut wood that drifted in through the open door. It was the kind of evening that spoke of quiet routines, of the mundane moments that were starting to feel like home. Jessie had spent the better part of the afternoon outside, working on the small garden they had begun to cultivate behind the house. He wasn't much of a gardener, but he'd learned enough over the years to know how to keep the land from being wasted. He'd also learned over the course of these last few weeks that his connection to the earth, his need to shape it, to make it work, was more than just about survival. It was something deeper, something that made him feel, if only for a moment, like he was doing something right. His footsteps, firm and steady, were the first sound Charlotte heard as he approached the door. She didn't look up immediately, instead keeping her attention on the stew, but there was a subtle shift in her posture, a quiet awareness that had grown between them, without either of them acknowledging it. Jessie stepped inside, his boots scraping softly against the wooden floor as he removed his hat and set it on the hook by the door. He ran a hand through his hair, the dust from the garden still clinging to his skin and clothes. Charlotte's eyes flickered toward him for just a moment, the corner of her mouth twitching ever so slightly. The silent acknowledgement of the day's work, the sweat, the toil, the shared understanding that neither of them had to say a word for the other to know what it meant to survive in a place like Redemption. He made his way to the table, brushing the dust from his hands as he sat down. His eyes lingered on her for a moment, the soft glow of the evening light casting a warm halo around her figure. There was a kind of quiet strength in the way she moved, the way she handled herself, handling the duties of the household as though it was second nature. And though he would never admit it aloud, it was something Jessie found both comforting and humbling. Charlotte, in turn, found herself stealing glances at him when she thought he wasn't looking. It was in the way his broad shoulders set with quiet determination as he worked outside, in the careful way he handled the small tasks she had shown him, and in the way he seemed to respect her need for space, for time, and for the things that mattered to her. "Smells good in here," Jessie finally spoke, his voice low and warm. It was a simple statement, but the tone of it, the way he spoke as if they had shared this routine for years, made something stir in Charlotte's chest. "Dinner should be ready soon," she said softly, offering a smile that was genuine but careful. She set the spoon down beside the pot and turned toward the table, the quiet between them settling like the soft weight of the evening air. For a long moment neither of them said anything. The only sound, the distant hum of the wind outside and the soft rustle of their movements. Charlotte busied herself with setting the table, the small clinks of the silverware punctuating the silence. Jessie leaned back in his chair, his eyes following her movements, his thoughts drifting between the tasks that lay ahead and the life that had begun to unfold in ways he had never imagined. It was strange, this life they were building together. It wasn't romantic in the way Charlotte had once dreamed of. There were no grand gestures, no whispered promises of love, but there was something else between them now, something deeper that couldn't be ignored. In their shared silence, in the small gestures of mutual respect, there was the beginning of something more, something neither of them could fully articulate, but both felt. Jessie's voice broke the stillness again, this time quieter, almost as if he were testing the waters. "How's the school?" he asked, his gaze steady on her as she placed the last of the plates on the table. Charlotte paused for a moment, her fingers brushing the edge of the plate as she met his gaze. "It's going well," she said, the warmth of her smile softening her features. "The children are eager to learn, and I'm seeing progress, slowly but surely." "Good," Jessie replied, his voice gruff but sincere. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, a quiet pride that she hadn't expected. He wasn't one to speak much about his emotions, but the subtlety of his words held more weight than 1,000 spoken promises. Charlotte looked at him for a moment, her heart inexplicably lighter at the sound of his approval. The awkwardness that had defined their early days together, those first hesitant steps of their strange partnership, had begun to fade. What had once been a reluctant alliance was slowly becoming something else. She sat down across from him, their eyes meeting again over the table. The meal before them was simple, humble, but it felt like more than just food. It was a symbol of the life they were trying to build, a life that, though imperfect, was beginning to take shape in small, quiet ways. As they began to eat, the conversation turned to the mundane details of their day, what needed to be done around the house, what Charlotte had planned for the next day at school, the repairs Jessie had made to the fence outside. It was nothing extraordinary, just the small, ordinary moments that made up a life. But in those moments there was something profound. There was a growing connection, a shared understanding that, despite the differences in their pasts, they were beginning to find common ground. As the evening stretched into night, the small room felt warmer, more intimate than it had before. There was no grand confession between them, no deep declarations of love or promises of forever. But there was something else, something unspoken, that tied them together, something that went beyond necessity and touched on something deeper, the rhythm of their shared life, the quiet moments, the small exchanges, felt like the foundation of something new. And though both Charlotte and Jessie remained cautious, unsure of what the future held, there was a growing sense of optimism in the air. Not the kind born from naive dreams, but the kind born from two people who had come to understand, in their own way, that they might just be able to build something worth holding on to. As the night deepened and the last embers of the fire crackled out, Charlotte and Jessie settled into their quiet rhythm. The world outside was still, and for the first time since their unlikely union, they both felt the fragile hope that perhaps, just perhaps, they were beginning to build something together. The sun was high, casting its harsh, unrelenting heat across the plains as Jessie McCall walked along the edge of town. The familiar dust clung to his boots and the brim of his hat, his pace slow and measured as he let the solitude of the open land clear his mind. These quiet walks were the only time he allowed himself to think, to sift through the weight of his decisions and the weight of his past. The town had been strangely peaceful of late, and he could almost convince himself that redemption might offer him the kind of life he had been searching for. But the past had a way of following him, creeping up at the edges of his thoughts, like a shadow waiting to consume him. As his boots crunched softly against the dry earth, a sudden movement caught his eye from the corner of his vision. He turned just in time to see a figure step from behind a cluster of mesquite trees. Jessie's hand instinctively moved to the grip of his gun, his instincts kicking in before his mind could process. The man who appeared before him was tall, broad-shouldered and familiar. Too familiar. "Didn't expect to see you here, Black Jack," the man said, his voice a low rasp, as though it had been worn down by years of rough living. Jessie's pulse quickened, but his face remained impassive. He knew the man. Hank Davis, an old associate from his days with a gang that had terrorized the frontier, now a bounty hunter looking for one last big payday. The man's dark eyes gleamed with the same coldness Jessie remembered from their last encounter years ago. "I'm not that man anymore," Jessie said, his voice steady, but the words felt foreign in his mouth. He had worked too hard to shed the name, to bury the past, and yet here it was, rising up again, demanding his attention. Davis's lips twisted into a cruel grin. "No running from what you've done. You owe me, McCall, and I'm here to collect." Jessie's heart beat faster now, the old familiar surge of fear and anger rushing through him. His eyes flickered toward the town, toward Charlotte, and for the first time he wondered if the past might catch up to him here, in this fragile peace he had found. The silence between them stretched long and tense, the weight of the confrontation settling heavy in the air. Jessie could feel it, the same feeling that had always accompanied a standoff, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for the first move. "You're mistaken if you think I'll go back to that life," Jessie said, his voice low but firm. "I'm done with it." "Done?" Davis sneered, his hand twitching near the holster at his side. "Doesn't matter what you're done with. You can't change what's in your blood. And that blood's on my hands." The words cut through the silence like a blade, and before Jessie could react, Davis's hand flashed for his gun. The movement was swift, but Jessie was faster. His own hand was already on the grip of his revolver, his finger pulling back the hammer in one fluid motion. The desert air seemed to stand still as Jesse's gun came up, the tension so thick it felt like the land itself was holding its breath. His heart raced, the noise of it filling his ears, drowning out the world around him. "You don't want to do this," Jesse warned, his voice steady, though his insides churned. This was the moment that had been building for years, the moment when he would have to prove once and for all that he wasn't the man Davis thought he was. Davis's grin widened, a mad gleam in his eyes. "I don't want to do this either, McCall, but you've got a debt to pay." The next few moments played out in the space between heartbeats, the air humming with a dangerous kind of electricity. Then, just as the tension reached its peak, a shout pierced the silence. Charlotte Harper had been walking toward the schoolhouse when she heard it. A sharp, urgent sound carried on the wind. She paused, her hand resting on the wooden fence that separated the town from the open plains. There was something in the air, something off. She had heard rumors about the violence in this town, about the men who lived by their own code, but she had never imagined she would be a witness to it. Her steps quickened, a sudden worry tightening in her chest as she moved toward the source of the noise. She could hear the faint echoes of raised voices in the distance, the deep rumble of a man speaking sharply, followed by the unmistakable sound of a gun being drawn. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized that she was too close to ignore. Her heart pounded in her chest as she pushed through the thick brush and moved toward the open space at the edge of town. As she stepped out from the cover of the trees, the sight before her stopped her in her tracks. Jesse and Hank Davis stood facing each other, their hands hovering near their weapons. The air was thick with tension, the kind that spoke of danger and violence. Charlotte's stomach twisted as she took in the scene, the stark primal threat between the two men. Jesse's face was hard, his jaw set in that familiar, determined line, but there was something else in his eyes. Fear. Fear for her. The reality of his past, the life he had tried so hard to leave behind, was standing before her. She felt it then, a cold wave of understanding crashing over her, sweeping away any illusions she had held about the world Jesse had lived in. The truth was raw and shocking. She had heard whispers, yes, but seeing it, seeing him like this, standing on the brink of violence, made the cost of his past more real than she could have ever imagined. Her heart raced as the distance between her and the men seemed to stretch farther, even as she found herself moving forward, unable to tear her eyes away from the confrontation before her. The weight of the moment bore down on her, and in that instant she understood what Jesse had meant when he said he could never truly escape the man he had been. She had been so sure, so certain, that she could make a difference in this town, that she could shape the future with her own hands, but the reality was more complicated than she had ever realized. This was Jesse's world, and now it was her world too. The sight of Jesse standing there, facing the man from his past, struck Charlotte in a way she couldn't have prepared for. Her mind raced, trying to process the enormity of what she was witnessing, the raw violence, the unspoken history between them. It was a world she had never known, a world of hard choices and even harder lives. Her legs felt unsteady as she stepped closer, the sound of her footsteps betraying her presence. Jesse's eyes flickered to her for a brief moment, his face momentarily softening, but the hardness quickly returned, and he turned his attention back to the man before him. Charlotte's breath caught in her throat as she realized what she had just seen. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was the legacy of violence that Jesse had carried with him for so long, and in that moment she realized just how much of a cost there was to the life he had lived, and just how far that past was willing to follow him. Her heart ached for him, for the man who had been forced to live a life he never truly wanted. She saw the struggle in his eyes, the desire to protect her, to protect the future they were building, even as the ghosts of his past threatened to pull him back into the darkness. Jesse had never asked for sympathy, but Charlotte couldn't help the wave of empathy that washed over her. He had carried this burden alone for so long, and now, standing in the midst of it, she felt the weight of it too. This wasn't just about love or survival anymore. It was about understanding, about facing the truths that neither of them could ever have fully prepared for. The emotional impact hit her like a wave, the harsh reality of the life Jessie had led and the life they were now trying to build together. It wasn't going to be easy. It was never going to be simple. But in that moment, Charlotte knew with a certainty she hadn't expected, she would stand by him. Even if it meant facing the darkness of his past, she would stand by him. And together they would find a way forward. Chapter 5. Aftermath and Reflection. The desert was vast, a sea of endless dust and stone that stretched far beyond the reach of the human eye. The faint wind carried the scent of the earth, dry, worn, and heavy with the weight of the past. Jessie McCall stood at the edge of the small ridge, looking down at the quiet town of Redemption, now shrouded in the soft haze of twilight. His fists clenched at his sides, his shoulders tense beneath the weight of the moment. The confrontation with Hank Davis still echoed in his mind, the harsh words, the cold promise of a reckoning that hadn't come to fruition. Yet Jessie's heart was still pounding, his breath shallow as he tried to push away the lingering anger, the frustration and the shame. His thoughts swirled in chaotic circles, each one leading back to the same unavoidable truth. The man he had been was still very much a part of him. He had tried so damn hard to outrun that man, to bury the violence, the ruthless actions that had once defined his life. But Hank's appearance, those cold, familiar eyes, had shattered the fragile illusion he'd built. No matter how far he ran, no matter how much he changed, his past was a weight he couldn't shed. Jessie turned away from the town, his gaze landing on the distant hills. But it didn't bring the sense of freedom he had expected. Instead, it only served as a reminder of how little he had truly escaped. His muscles ached from the tension that had gripped him during the standoff, but it wasn't just his body that was bruised, it was his soul. He had thought, for a moment, that maybe he could leave all of this behind, that he could walk away from the violence and the bloodshed. But the past didn't let go so easily. It never did. "You shouldn't be out here," a voice said quietly, and Jessie froze. He didn't need to look to know who it was. The tone was familiar now, soft yet unyielding. Charlotte's footsteps were gentle but determined as she approached him, her presence grounding in a way he hadn't expected. He had known she would come, had felt the pull of her concern in the air, even as he tried to escape it. "I'm fine," Jessie muttered, his voice rough. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon, unwilling to face her just yet. "Fine?" Charlotte repeated, her voice tinged with disbelief. "You're out here alone, after a confrontation that nearly escalated into something dangerous. How can you say you're fine?" Her words were sharp, but they didn't cut. They didn't pierce the way others would. Instead, they settled on him, landing like a gentle weight on his chest. She was right, of course. He wasn't fine. He hadn't been fine for a long time, not since the moment he had stepped foot in Redemption. But Charlotte didn't know the whole story. She couldn't. The scars of his past ran too deep for words, too raw for him to even try to explain. "I didn't want you to see that," he said finally, his voice low and gravelly. "I didn't want you to know who I really am." Charlotte moved closer, and he could feel her presence beside him, warm and unwavering. "I know you're not perfect, Jessie," she said softly, her words surprisingly gentle. "I never thought you were, but I also know that you're not that man anymore. That's why I'm here." The raw honesty in her words caught him off guard, and for the first time in days the knot in his chest loosened ever so slightly. It wasn't forgiveness she was offering, it wasn't pity or some misguided notion that everything would be all right. What Charlotte was offering in that moment was something deeper. She was offering understanding. Jessie exhaled sharply, the breath leaving his lungs in a rush. "I don't know how to make peace with it," he admitted quietly. "I don't know how to leave it behind. Every time I think I've moved on, something drags me back into it. The violence, the blood. It's always there, Charlotte, and no matter what I do, I can't outrun it." Charlotte's hand found his arm then, a gentle touch, and Jessie flinched slightly before relaxing under her fingers. She wasn't afraid of him, not even after seeing the man he had been, and that, more than anything, made him want to change. "You don't have to outrun it," she said, her voice firm. "You don't have to bury it either. But you have to stop letting it define you. The past doesn't have to control you, Jessie. You've already taken the hardest step. You've started. The rest will come, but you have to let it, and you have to trust me. Trust us. We're in this together." Her words were simple, but they settled in the deepest part of him, where the darkness had long since taken root. Trust. It was a word he hadn't allowed himself to believe in for a long time. Trust had been broken too many times, by too many people, to ever mean something pure again. But Charlotte? Charlotte wasn't like the others. She had never asked for more than he could give, never pushed him to be someone he wasn't. "I'm not good at trusting anyone," he said hoarsely, his eyes meeting hers for the first time since they had begun this conversation. Charlotte smiled softly, her hand still resting on his arm. "I know," she said gently. "But I'm not asking you to trust everyone. I'm just asking you to trust me." The weight of her words, her unwavering presence, settled in the pit of his stomach. For the first time in a long time, Jessie felt the stirrings of something more than guilt or fear. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was the beginning of something. A shift, a change. As the sun began to sink lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the desert floor, Charlotte and Jessie stood side by side, the world stretching out before them. There was no grand resolution, no promise of an easy future, but there was understanding, a quiet truce between them that neither of them had expected, but both had needed. Jessie knew the road ahead would be long. The ghosts of his past would never be fully gone, but maybe, just maybe, with Charlotte by his side, he could find a way to face them, step by uncertain step. The night settled in around them, and though the darkness still loomed, there was a flicker of something else in the air, something that felt like the first stirring of peace, and maybe, just maybe, that would be enough for now. The fire crackled and popped in the small hearth, its orange glow casting flickering shadows on the walls of the modest cabin. The scent of burning wood and the earthy warmth of the flames filled the air, wrapping the two figures in a blanket of quiet solitude. Outside, the wind howled, its voice rising and falling against the stillness of the night. But inside, in the dim glow of the firelight, there was a sense of intimacy, of shared space, and of something unspoken beginning to form between them. Jessie sat across from Charlotte, his long legs stretched out before him, boots resting comfortably on the wooden floor. The flickering firelight danced across his face, highlighting the hard lines of his jaw and the quiet tension in his gaze. His broad shoulders were relaxed, but there was a wariness to him, a hesitation, as if he were waiting for something. Waiting for a moment to open up, but unsure whether he was ready to face what might come out. Charlotte, too, was quiet. She had spent the evening making supper, and now, with the chores of the day behind her, she found herself watching the flames with a mix of reflection and curiosity. The flicker of the fire seemed to mirror the thoughts stirring in her own mind, thoughts she hadn't shared with anyone in a long time, thoughts about what this marriage, this strange, unexpected partnership, was beginning to mean. She glanced at Jessie, noting the hard set of his face, the way his eyes flickered toward the fire, distant and far away. Her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her sleeve as she considered speaking. There was so much she wanted to say, so much she had kept to herself for fear of seeming naive or overly idealistic. But something about the quiet of the cabin, the shared silence, seemed to invite honesty. Perhaps it was time. "You know," she began softly, her voice carrying an almost tentative quality, "I never imagined I'd be here, in a place like this, married to a man like you." Jessie's gaze shifted toward her, and for a moment their eyes met. There was something raw in his eyes, an unspoken understanding, a flicker of recognition. Then, just as quickly, it was gone, buried under the weight of his usual guardedness. "I didn't expect it either," he said, his voice low and rough.
"But here we are."
Charlotte nodded, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her sleeve as she took a steadying breath. The crackling fire seemed to grow louder in the silence that followed, the weight of their words settling between them. She couldn't help but wonder what this strange alliance, this unexpected union, was really built on. Was it just survival? Or was there something more? "Being a woman in a place like this," she continued, her voice steady but tinged with a quiet bitterness, "it's not easy. People expect certain things from you. They expect you to fit into a mould that doesn't leave much room for anything else." Jesse's brow furrowed slightly, his attention drawn fully to her now. "I can't say I know what that's like," he muttered, "but I can imagine it ain't easy." Charlotte met his gaze, and for the first time since they had married she felt the weight of their shared moment of understanding. "It's not just the work," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's the way they look at you, the way they dismiss you. People like me don't fit in here. I came here to make a difference, to teach. But sometimes I wonder if that's even possible. This town, this place, it's not built for progress, it's built on survival. And there's no room for someone like me." Jesse shifted slightly, leaning forward just a fraction, the firelight catching his sharp features. His expression softened, and for a fleeting moment Charlotte saw the man beneath the hard exterior. A man who had seen more than his fair share of struggles, more than his fair share of pain. His eyes softened as he met her gaze. "I get that," he said quietly. "I spend my life fighting against what the world expects of me, the law, the people, the places that wanted to make me into something I wasn't. All I wanted was to survive, to be free, but the truth is, sometimes survival isn't enough." The words hung in the air between them, charged with an honesty neither of them had expected. Charlotte's chest tightened at the rawness of it. It wasn't just survival, she realized. It was something more, something deeper that connected them in a way she hadn't anticipated. "I don't know what to do with all this," she confessed, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "This life, this marriage, I never thought I'd be here. Never thought I'd marry a man like you, but now that I'm here, I don't know what it means. I don't know what to expect." Jesse's face was unreadable for a moment, his gaze distant, as if he were contemplating something buried deep within. Then, after a long pause, he spoke again, his voice softer now, almost tender. "I don't know what it means either," he admitted, "but I can tell you this. I never thought I'd have anyone who'd stand by me. Not for who I am, not for what I've done. But you're still here, and that means something." The sincerity in his words settled over Charlotte like a weight, heavy but not oppressive. She took a breath, her heart fluttering in her chest. It wasn't love, not yet. But it was something else, something that felt real, something that felt like the beginning of something neither of them had expected. As the firelight flickered between them, casting long shadows on the walls, the conversation shifted again, this time toward the past. The weight of secrets hung in the air like a heavy fog. Charlotte could see it in his eyes, the burden he carried with every word. She wasn't the only one with a history she had tried to leave behind. Jesse exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening as he glanced at the flames. "You asked me before about my past," he began, his voice low, almost guarded. "It's not something I talk about. I don't like to remember it." Charlotte's heart clenched at the rawness in his tone. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to," she said softly, "but if you do, I'm here to listen." There was a long pause before he spoke again, his voice heavy with the weight of memories. "I didn't start out wanting to be an outlaw, you know. I didn't set out to hurt anyone. But the world doesn't give you much choice. You either fight or you get trampled. And when you're young and hungry and you got nothing, you do things you can't take back. Things that follow you no matter how hard you try to run." His words hung in the air, heavy with regret. Charlotte could feel the depth of his pain, the scars that ran deeper than any physical wound. She didn't know how to fix it, how to erase the years of darkness that clung to him, but she wanted to. She wanted to be the one who could give him something better, something worth fighting for. "I'm not proud of what I've done," he added, his eyes meeting hers again, soft and raw. "But I'm here. I'm trying. And that has to count for something." The silence between them felt different now, filled with an understanding that neither of them had expected. Their walls, though still high, had cracked just enough to let something real, something raw, slip through. Charlotte reached across the small space between them, her hand hovering for just a moment before settling gently on his. It was a simple touch, but it felt like everything in that moment. The warmth of her fingers against his, the unspoken promise of shared strength. Jesse didn't pull away. Instead, his hand softened beneath hers, his fingers tightening around hers just a little. It wasn't much, but it was enough to show her that despite the weight of their pasts, despite the scars they carried, there was still something between them worth nurturing. The fire crackled in the silence, the flames licking at the wood with quiet intensity. Neither of them spoke, but both of them knew that something had shifted. Something fragile and tentative, but real. In the quiet stillness of the night, amidst the weight of their shared secrets and struggles, they found a kind of peace, imperfect and uncertain, but a beginning nonetheless. And for the first time, Charlotte allowed herself to believe that perhaps they could build something from the ruins of their pasts. Together. The fire had burned low, its embers flickering softly in the hearth, casting gentle light on the worn walls of the small cabin. The night had deepened, and the world outside seemed to be settling into its own kind of peace, a stillness that mirrored the quiet between them. Jesse sat across from Charlotte, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze occasionally flickering toward the fading glow of the fire. The weight of the day had softened, the tension of earlier encounters now replaced by something gentler, something more tentative. Charlotte sat in the same chair, her legs tucked beneath her, watching the last of the flames dance and crackle. Her thoughts, though still filled with uncertainty, were less frantic now. The rawness of their conversation had opened something inside her, a fragile space where understanding, though imperfect, had begun to take root. She no longer felt the urgency to fill every moment with words. For the first time since they had come together, the silence between them was comfortable, not filled with tension or awkwardness, but with the quiet understanding that had grown between them, piece by fragile piece. They had spoken of many things, of the past, of the future, of the small everyday challenges that had brought them here, but there was something unsaid between them, something unspoken, that seemed to hang in the air like the fading light of the fire. It wasn't love, not yet, and neither of them expected it to be, but it was something else, a bond, tentative and fragile, yet unmistakable in its presence. It was the beginning of something neither of them had anticipated, but both of them had longed for, a shared understanding, a tacit agreement that perhaps, just perhaps, they could build something from the ashes of their pasts. Jesse shifted slightly, his eyes lingering on the fire before turning toward Charlotte. He had said little since their conversation had slowed to a quiet hum, and Charlotte couldn't help but feel the absence of the usual tension between them. He wasn't the man who had walked into town so many weeks ago, tired, broken, burdened by the weight of his past. And she wasn't the woman who had arrived, eager to change the world, but fearful of the challenges she would face in a town that would never fully accept her. They were both different now, and in that difference there was something hopeful, something that suggested a path forward, even if it was still shrouded in uncertainty. Charlotte spoke first, her voice soft but steady. "It's funny, isn't it?" she said, almost as if thinking aloud. "How life can change so quickly. One minute you're living a life you never thought you would, and the next you're doing things you never imagined. Things you didn't think you were capable of." Jesse didn't answer immediately, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made Charlotte's heart skip a beat. She could see the conflict in his gaze, the same battle he had fought with himself since he had set foot in redemption. It wasn't just about the past. It was about who they were becoming, who they had yet to understand in each other. "I never imagined I'd be here either," Jesse said, his voice quieter now, almost as if the words had to be coaxed out of him. "I never thought I'd find someone who'd see me differently. Not after everything. Not after all I've done." Charlotte felt a sudden shift in the air, a subtle but powerful change as she absorbed his words. She leaned forward, her hands resting lightly on her lap, her gaze steady on him. "And yet here we are," she said, her voice soft but certain. "You're not the man you were, Jesse, I know that. You don't have to prove anything to me. I see you, who you are now, not who you were. That's what matters." The weight of her words settled over him, and for a moment neither of them moved. Jesse's gaze softened, and in the quiet glow of the firelight, Charlotte saw something in his eyes she hadn't expected, something vulnerable, something raw. It was a fleeting look, quickly masked by the steady resolve that had always been part of him, but it was there. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not used to being seen that way." Charlotte's heart warmed at his words, the simple gratitude in them doing more for her than any grand gesture could. In that moment, she realized that this marriage, this arrangement born of necessity, had become something else. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something genuine, something real. The fire flickered one last time, casting shadows that stretched long across the walls before finally settling into quiet embers. Charlotte stood and stretched, her muscles stiff from sitting so long. She moved toward the fire to poke at the remaining embers, and Jesse followed her, standing slowly, his movements stiff but purposeful. For a brief moment their eyes met again. No words passed between them, but in that simple glance something passed between them. A quiet understanding. They were in this together, even if the path ahead was unclear, even if they didn't know exactly what would come next. They were no longer strangers, bound by necessity, but two people who had found in each other something worth holding on to. As the night deepened and the world outside grew still, Charlotte and Jessie found themselves sitting together in the quiet. The soft glow of the fire, the only light in the room. The walls of the cabin, though humble, seemed to hold a sense of warmth now, a reflection of the understanding that had begun to take root between them. Neither of them spoke much more, the silence stretching comfortably between them. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that comes with shared experience, with the quiet understanding that sometimes words aren't necessary to convey what needs to be said. As Charlotte settled into the chair beside the hearth and Jessie leaned against the wall, a sense of peace began to settle over both of them. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't complete, but it was enough for now. The promise of something more, something that could grow from this shared understanding, hung in the air, fragile but present. They were both weary, but there was a quiet optimism in the air, an unspoken agreement that perhaps, just perhaps, they could face whatever came next, together, and for the first time in a long while both of them felt a little less alone. The air in Redemption had shifted. What was once a town filled with the quiet hum of daily life had turned restless, a nervous energy creeping into the spaces between conversations. The whispers started in the saloon, low murmurs over mugs of stale beer, anxious glances exchanged between men who were used to hardship, but never quite ready for what the frontier could throw at them. It didn't take long for the rumors to find their way into the streets. By midday the blacksmith was hammering iron with more force than necessary, his blows sharp and angry against the anvil. The general store was unusually crowded, women murmuring behind cupped hands as they gathered supplies in a rush, their faces drawn with worry. The usual small-town banter had faded, replaced by the weighted silence of anticipation. Outlaws were coming, and not just any outlaws. A band of them, ruthless and lawless, the kind that took what they wanted and left nothing but ruin behind. A few of the older men recalled similar raids in the past, towns gutted, people driven out, or worse. It was the kind of fear that spread fast, igniting every mind with the worst possible outcome. By late afternoon, the town had made its decision. A meeting would be held at the community hall. Plans needed to be made. If Redemption had any hope of surviving what was coming, they needed to stand together. The community hall was packed, every wooden bench filled, every space along the walls occupied by men and women standing shoulder to shoulder. The air was thick with tension, the kind that came before a storm. The lanterns overhead flickered as nervous voices filled the room, arguments already beginning before the meeting had even officially started. Sheriff Gideon Slater stood at the front of the room, rubbing his temples as the voices around him grew louder. The sheriff was a good man, but he wasn't a fighter. He had done his best to keep order in Redemption, but he knew his limits, and this was beyond him. "They say they'll be here in less than a week," old Mr. Tully said from his seat near the front, his voice raspy with age and worry. "We don't have enough men to fight 'em off." "They'll burn us to the ground if we don't do something," another voice added. "We could try negotiating," someone suggested from the back. Jesse McCall, standing against the far wall with his arms crossed, let out a slow breath, listening as the townsfolk debated, fear creeping into every word. He knew how this would play out if they didn't act fast. He had seen towns like this before. Good people who didn't know how to fight, who would either roll over in surrender or be trampled trying to defend themselves without a plan. Jesse pushed off the wall, the room slowly quieting as they noticed him stepping forward. His reputation carried weight, even among the most skeptical of them. "This isn't just some band of desperate men looking for food," Jesse said, his voice calm but firm. "These are raiders. They take what they want and kill whoever gets in their way. And if we don't get smart, that's exactly what's going to happen here." A murmur rippled through the room, a mix of fear and reluctant acknowledgement. Sheriff Slater eyed him warily. "And what do you suggest, McCall?" Jesse let the question settle for a moment before answering. "We turn this town into something they don't want to fight." There were scoffs and a few skeptical grumbles, but Jesse continued. "They're looking for an easy target. If we make it clear we're not one, they might move on. That means fortifying the town, setting up guard rotations, keeping women and children safe in defensible buildings. We need lookouts on the ridge so we know exactly when they're coming." "You sound like you know a lot about this sort of thing," someone muttered. Jesse's jaw tightened, but he didn't waver. "I know the kind of men we're dealing with," he admitted, "and I know what it takes to stop them." Charlotte sat near the front, listening intently. She could hear the unspoken words in his voice, the weight of experience, the past he rarely spoke about. This was the world Jesse had come from, and as much as she hated that he had ever been part of it, she couldn't deny the way he commanded the room now, the way people listened when he spoke. And that terrified her, because while she admired his strength, she knew that stepping back into that world, even for the sake of the town, would come at a cost. Just as the townsfolk were starting to rally behind Jesse's plan, the doors to the hall swung open with a loud bang, cutting through the murmured conversations. The room fell into hushed silence as a group of men strode in, their polished boots clacking against the floor. Sheriff Slater stiffened. Jesse turned slowly, recognizing the look of these men immediately, the way they carried themselves, the smug arrogance in their eyes. Lawmen, but not the good kind. The tallest among them, a man with a sheriff's badge pinned to his coat, smirked as he scanned the room. "Looks like we came at the right time," he drawled, his voice dripping with condescension. "Name's Sheriff Willard Kane. I represent the authorities in the next county over." "Didn't know we needed your kind here," Jesse muttered, crossing his arms. Kane's gaze flicked to him, eyes narrowing. "You do well to hold your tongue, McCall," he said coolly. "We've heard about the trouble coming your way. My men and I are here to restore order." "Order?" Charlotte asked, her brow furrowing. "Or control?" Kane turned his attention to her, his lips curling into something that resembled a smile but held no warmth. "Lady, you don't understand how these things work. We take over, we make sure no harm comes to your town. Simple as that." Jesse stepped forward, his voice low and edged with warning. "And what does that cost?" Kane's smile widened. "A little cooperation, a little authority. This town needs men who can make the hard choices." He glanced around at the gathered townsfolk, some of whom already looked uncertain. "I'm offering you protection. The alternative? Well, I'm sure I don't have to spell it out." Jesse could see what Kane was doing, preying on fear, dangling false security in front of desperate people. He had seen men like this before. They weren't here to help. They were here to take, and that, more than the outlaws riding toward them, made his blood run cold. Charlotte could see the shift in Jesse's posture, the hardening of his stance, the way his hands curled into fists at his sides. She understood then, in that moment, that he wasn't just standing against the outlaws. He was standing against everything that had made men like Kane possible, and he wasn't going to back down. The meeting dissolved into tense arguments. Townsfolk divided between trusting Kane's authority or rallying behind Jesse's plan. The weight of the choice ahead pressed down on everyone. By the time Charlotte and Jesse left the hall, the night air was thick with uncertainty. Charlotte walked beside him, stealing a glance at his hardened expression. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Jesse exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. "Now," he said, his voice low, "now we fight for redemption." And for the first time, Charlotte wasn't sure which battle would be harder, the one against the outlaws or the one against the men who claimed to stand for justice. Either way, she knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, she and Jesse were in it together. The sun hung low in the sky, burning amber against the dust-choked horizon. The quiet hum of daily life had vanished from redemption, replaced by a town on edge, bracing for the inevitable. The air was thick with tension, but there was no room for hesitation. There was work to be done. Jesse McCall stood in the center of town, his sharp gaze sweeping over the gathered men, some eager, others reluctant. They were farmers, blacksmiths, shopkeepers, good men, but not fighters. They had never raised a gun for anything more than hunting game, never stood against the kind of men who would soon descend upon them with ruthless intent. He took a deep breath and squared his shoulders, drawing on a lifetime of experience he had tried so hard to leave behind. But now, that knowledge, his past, was the only thing standing between redemption and ruin. "All right, listen up," Jesse called, his voice steady. The men fell silent, their faces grim. "We ain't got the numbers, but we've got the advantage. This is our town. We know its streets, its buildings, its hiding spots. They don't." He let that settle before continuing. "If we fight smart, we can hold them off." He stepped forward, gesturing toward the outskirts. "First thing we do is block off the north and west roads. They'll try to ride straight through town, so we make sure they come." Tom Miller, the town blacksmith, wiped sweat from his brow and nodded. "Got plenty of scrap wood and old wagon wheels. We can pile 'em up, make it a real mess to get through." Jesse nodded approvingly. "Good. And we set up sharpshooters along the rooftops. They come in, we make 'em regret it." Sheriff Slater, his face drawn with worry, stepped up beside him. "And what about the folks who can't fight?" Jesse's eyes flickered toward the schoolhouse, where he knew Charlotte was working tirelessly. "We keep them safe," he said simply. "I'll leave that to her." Charlotte Harper moved swiftly through the schoolhouse, her hands filled with strips of cloth, bottles of whiskey and bandages. If there was one thing she could do, it was prepare for the aftermath. She had never fought in a battle, had never wielded a weapon beyond a kitchen knife, but she knew how to mend wounds. Mrs. Jenkins, one of the older women in town, worked beside her. "This is a fool's fight," she muttered under her breath. "They'll tear us apart." Charlotte's hands stilled on the bundle of herbs she had been tying together. She looked up, her eyes sharp. "If we don't fight, they'll take everything." The older woman's face softened and she nodded. "Then we best be ready." They turned the schoolhouse into a makeshift infirmary, pushing desks against the walls to make space for wounded. A few of the townswomen carried in extra blankets, while others boiled water over the stove. The schoolhouse had once been a place of learning, of hope. Now it was a place of survival. Charlotte swallowed the lump in her throat and forced herself to stay focused. There was no room for fear. Outside, men hammered boards across shop doors and windows, reinforcing weak points, while younger boys ran messages between groups. A nervous energy buzzed through the town, an unspoken understanding passing between them. There was no running from this. As the preparations stretched into the evening, Jesse found himself alone, leaning against the side of the livery stable, his arms crossed over his chest. The weight of the town's survival rested on his shoulders, and he knew it. He had lived a life that many of these men would never understand. He had been the one raiding towns like this once, riding in under the cover of night, taking what he wanted, leaving only destruction behind. Now he was on the other side of it. Redemption. It was a fitting name. But could a man like him ever truly earn it? He let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand over the back of his neck. It didn't matter. The past didn't matter anymore. What mattered was what came next. What mattered was keeping these people safe. Keeping her safe. His gaze shifted toward the schoolhouse, where he could see the soft glow of lantern light through the window. Charlotte was in there, working, planning, making sure the wounded would have care. She was stronger than he had realized. Charlotte had come to this town to teach, to bring hope to children who had never known anything beyond survival. And now she was preparing for a war she never should have had to fight. Jesse straightened, his jaw tightening. He would not let this town fall. And he would not let Charlotte suffer for it. Inside the schoolhouse, Charlotte paused by the window, watching Jesse from a distance. She had seen the way the men followed him, the way even the skeptics had come to trust his leadership. He was no longer just a man with a tarnished reputation. He was the man standing between redemption and ruin. And she was terrified for him. She had never thought she would care so much. When this arrangement had begun, she had viewed Jesse as nothing more than a necessity, a means of securing her place in town. But now she saw the man beneath the hardened exterior, a man who carried his past like a burden he could never set down, a man willing to fight for a town that had never fully accepted him. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the windowsill. Was this what trust felt like, or was it something more? She didn't know, and now wasn't the time to figure it out. All she knew was that she didn't want to lose him. As the night deepened, the town fell into a tense quiet. The barricades were in place. The men stood ready. The schoolhouse was stocked with supplies. Jesse stood at the edge of town, staring out into the darkness, knowing that somewhere beyond those hills the raiders were coming. He could feel it. Behind him, Charlotte stepped forward, silent but present. She didn't need to say anything, they both knew. Tomorrow would change everything. But tonight, they would stand together, side by side. Because for the first time in their lives, they had something worth fighting for. Chapter 6. The Climactic Confrontation. The first shots rang out just as the sun began to crest over the hills, slicing through the quiet dawn with a sharp finality. Jesse McCall had been waiting for it, his body taut as a drawn bowstring, his fingers flexing near the grip of his revolver. He crouched low behind the barricade, his breath steady despite the electric tension crackling through the air. He could hear the distant thunder of hooves, the marauders advancing at full speed. Dust billowing behind them like a storm bearing down on redemption. They came hard and fast, riders clad in tattered coats, their faces hidden beneath dust-covered bandanas, their weapons glinting in the morning light. The ground shook with the force of their charge, and for a single terrible moment Jesse wondered if they had done enough, if they could hold the town, if the lives they were protecting would be enough to make up for the ones he had once helped destroy. Then the first of the raiders reached the barricades. "Hold the line!" Jesse shouted, raising his rifle. Gunfire erupted in an ear-splitting volley, the air thick with the acrid stench of gunpowder. Bullets slammed into wood, dirt kicked up in wild sprays, and the town of Redemption became a battleground. The men Jessie had trained, the blacksmiths, the ranchers, the shopkeepers, fired from rooftops and alleyways, picking off riders as they struggled to break through. But the outlaws were relentless, their battle-hardened instincts making them formidable. Jessie took down a rider at the front, his shot clean and true, but another took his place instantly. The marauders were like a wave, crashing against their defences again and again, forcing their way forward. He pivoted, firing toward a man who had managed to clear the barricade, catching him in the leg before he could reach the schoolhouse. Despite the chaos, despite the gunfire and the shouts, Jessie's mind remained sharp. He had been in battles before. He knew the rhythm of war, the way the world seemed to slow into fragments, one breath, one shot, one kill at a time. But this wasn't like before. This time he was fighting for something. Charlotte Harper crouched inside the schoolhouse, her hands shaking as she tore another strip of cloth for a wound dressing. Blood smeared her fingers, and the moans of the wounded filled the room, but she didn't falter. There was no time for fear. She had spent her life in books, believing words and knowledge could shape the world. But now, knowledge wouldn't stop a bullet. Kindness wouldn't hold back death. Now, she had to be more than just a teacher. A gunshot cracked through the open doorway, too close. She flinched, but didn't stop. Mrs. Jenkins was pressing down on a bleeding rancher's side, and Charlotte worked swiftly, her fingers surprisingly steady as she tied the bandages tight. The door burst open, and for a split second, Charlotte's heart stopped. A man stood in the threshold, silhouetted against the morning light. His bandana hid his face, but the gun in his grip was unmistakable. Charlotte's mind raced. She had no weapon, no way to stop him. She reached blindly for the nearest object, an iron poker by the hearth, her breath catching in her throat. But before she could move, a gunshot rang out. The outlaw stiffened, his weapon clattering to the ground as he crumpled to his knees. Charlotte turned, her chest rising and falling rapidly, to see Jessie standing just outside the doorway, his revolver smoking. Their eyes met across the room, the chaos of the battle momentarily forgotten. "You all right?" Jessie called, his voice rough, desperate. Charlotte nodded, swallowing past the lump in her throat. "Yes." Then Jessie was gone, back into the fray, and Charlotte turned back to the wounded, knowing the battle wasn't over yet. The gunfire slowed, the smoke from the rifles and revolvers hung thick in the air, settling over the battlefield like a ghostly shroud. The outlaws, realizing their losses were too great, had begun to scatter. Some fled into the hills, disappearing into the wild beyond redemption. Others lay still in the dust, their fight over. Jessie stood in the middle of the street, his breathing ragged, his revolver still clenched in his hand. Around him the town was battered, but still standing. They had won. The realization sank into his bones like a weight too heavy to feel like victory just yet. His eyes swept the street, searching, until he found her. Charlotte stood at the steps of the schoolhouse, her dress streaked with blood, some of it hers, most of it not. She was exhausted, her shoulders slumped, but when she lifted her gaze to his, something unspoken passed between them. She had seen him at his worst today. She had seen the man he had once been, the man he had tried to leave behind, and yet she had stood her ground, had fought in her own way, had been just as much a part of this battle as any man with a rifle. He took a step toward her. She took a step toward him. They met in the center of the street, standing amidst the wreckage of the battle, amidst the blood and dust and ruin. "You all right?" Jessie asked again, softer this time. Charlotte let out a breath. "I should be asking you that." A wry smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I've had worse." She looked away for a moment, her lips pressing into a thin line before she spoke. I never understood what it was like for you, what it meant to live with the choices you've made." Jessie swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. "But today," she continued, looking back at him, "I saw you fight for something more. You fought for them. For us." His throat tightened. He didn't deserve her words, but hearing them settled something deep inside him. "Didn't have much of a choice," he murmured. Charlotte gave him a knowing look. "Yes, you did." They stood in silence for a long moment, both absorbing what had passed, what had changed. This wasn't just a town anymore. This was home, and whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The townspeople moved slowly through the wreckage, assessing the damage, tending to the wounded and mourning the dead. It would take time to rebuild, but redemption had survived. Jessie and Charlotte stood side by side, watching as the sun began to rise fully over the town, casting light on the battlefield that had nearly become a graveyard. Jessie reached out, hesitant, and let his fingers brush against hers. It was small, barely noticeable, but Charlotte felt it. She turned her hand slightly, allowing the touch to linger. They didn't need words. The battle was over, but their story was just beginning, and for the first time, Jesse McCall allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, redemption wasn't just the name of this town. It was his too. The first rays of dawn crept over the town of Redemption, casting golden light on the battered remains of what had once been a peaceful settlement. Smoke still curled from buildings that had taken fire, and the air was thick with the scent of gunpowder, blood, and dust. The ground was littered with the remnants of battle, scattered bullet casings, overturned barrels, and the bodies of men who had come to take and had lost instead. But amidst the destruction, Redemption still stood, and its people were still standing. Jesse McCall moved through the town like a ghost, his hat pulled low over his brow, his body aching from the bruises and exhaustion of the night's fight. But there was no time to dwell on that. There were people to help, wounds to mend, and a town that needed its survivors to be strong. Near the general store he spotted Tom Miller, the blacksmith, slumped against a water trough, a makeshift bandage tied tightly around his upper arm. His face was pale, his jaw clenched as he nodded at Jesse. "Damn good shooting last night," Tom muttered through gritted teeth. "Didn't think I had it in me." Jesse crouched down beside him, inspecting the bandage. "You did fine," he said, his voice low but steady. "We wouldn't have held them off without you." Tom let out a dry chuckle, wincing as he shifted. "Guess you were right about standing our ground." Jesse didn't answer, just gave him a firm nod before moving on. There were others who needed help. Near the church, a cluster of townsfolk gathered around the injured, tending to wounds with whatever supplies they had left. The schoolhouse had been turned into a makeshift infirmary overnight, and Jesse's gaze instinctively sought out one person, Charlotte. He found her outside the schoolhouse, kneeling beside a wounded farmer, her hands steady as she pressed a clean bandage to his side. Strands of her hair had fallen loose from their pins, her dress was stained with dust and blood, but her expression was resolute. She was exhausted. He could see it in the slump of her shoulders, in the dark smudges beneath her eyes. But she didn't stop. "More bandages," she called over her shoulder, her voice carrying across the morning air. "And bring more water." Jesse exhaled and stepped forward, dropping to a knee beside her. "You need rest," he murmured, reaching for the bandage roll in her hands. Charlotte barely glanced at him. "So do you?" she shot back, but she didn't stop him from helping. Together they worked in silence, side by side, tending to the wounded. Neither spoke of the battle. Neither acknowledged the pain in their own bodies. There was no time for that yet. But there was something in the way they moved, in the quiet efficiency of their hands, that spoke of understanding. Neither of them had ever expected to find themselves here. Jesse, a man who had spent most of his life running from his past, now standing as a protector. Charlotte, a woman who had come to teach, now tending to the aftermath of a fight she had never meant to be part of. And yet, here they were. Hours passed. The worst of the wounded had been cared for, the dead prepared for burial. The town was quieter now, filled with the hushed murmurs of mourning and relief. Jesse sat on the steps of the livery, rolling his aching shoulder as he watched the sun climb higher in the sky. His hands were raw, his knuckles bruised, but the worst pain settled in his chest. The weight of everything he had fought against, everything he had been willing to die for. Charlotte appeared beside him, lowering herself onto the step without a word. For a long moment neither spoke. The town had survived, but not without cost. "You ever think about the ones you couldn't save?" Jesse asked suddenly, his voice rough, edged with exhaustion. Charlotte turned her head to look at him, her blue eyes searching his. "Yes," she admitted quietly. But I try to remember the ones we did." Jessie let her words settle over him. He knew she was right. He had seen too many deaths in his lifetime, too many faces lost to the violence of the world, but this was different. This was the first time he had fought for something instead of against it, and that, he realized, made all the difference. Charlotte wrapped her arms around her knees, gazing out at the town. "I thought I came here to teach," she said after a long pause, "to give these children a future." Jessie glanced at her, the firelight of the morning casting a soft glow over her features. "You did," he said simply. Charlotte let out a tired breath, shaking her head. "Not the way I planned." Jessie smirked slightly despite himself. "Things rarely go the way we plan." She turned to him then, her expression softer now. "You didn't have to stay and fight," she murmured. "You could have left. Could have ridden out before they ever reached us." Jessie studied her, then looked back toward the distant horizon. "I could have," he admitted, "but I didn't want to." It was the truth, spoken simply. Charlotte didn't look away. "Why?" Jessie met her gaze, something shifting inside him. "Because I had something worth staying for." Her breath hitched, just slightly, but she didn't look away. The air between them was thick with something unspoken, something deeper than words could convey. Neither of them had been looking for this connection, this fragile bond that had been forged in fire and battle. But it was there now, impossible to ignore. Charlotte exhaled, her fingers curling slightly against the fabric of her dress. "I used to think survival was enough," she admitted, "that if I could build something lasting, something that mattered, it would be enough." Jessie's brow furrowed slightly. "And now?" She turned her head toward him, her voice soft but certain. "Now, I think who you build it with matters just as much." Jessie didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached out, hesitating just briefly before brushing his fingers over hers. It was a small touch, tentative but real. She didn't pull away. The town would rebuild. The scars of battle would fade, but what had been forged between them, this understanding, this trust, was something that neither of them had expected. And maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something more. The sun had fully risen now, casting light over the battered but standing town of redemption. People moved through the streets with a quiet determination, clearing the wreckage, reinforcing what had been broken. Life would go on. And for the first time, Jessie McCall and Charlotte Harper weren't just surviving, they were starting anew. Together. The small room inside the boarding house was quiet, save for the occasional crackle of the oil lamp on the nightstand. The light flickered across the modest furnishings, casting soft golden hues on the wooden walls. Jessie McCall sat on the edge of the bed, his shoulders rigid, his jaw tight as Charlotte dabbed a clean cloth against the gash along his ribs. He barely flinched, though she knew it must sting. "You could at least pretend this hurts," Charlotte murmured, her fingers gentle but firm as she worked. Jessie smirked, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "If I let on that it does, you might get ideas about fussing over me more than necessary." Charlotte gave him a pointed look before dipping the cloth into the basin again. The water was tinged red now, evidence of the long hours he had spent fighting to protect the town. They had both done their part. She could still feel the weight of it in her bones, the exhaustion that clung to her like a second skin. But at least now, in this quiet moment, there was peace. Jessie studied her as she worked, his eyes tracking the way her brows knit together in concentration, the way her lips pursed slightly when she focused. There was something about her, something steady and sure, something he had never realized he needed until now. "You should let me look at your arm," he said gruffly, nodding toward the faint tear in the fabric of her sleeve. Charlotte glanced down, surprised to find she had nearly forgotten about it. The scratch wasn't deep, but it was enough to remind her that she, too, had been part of the fight. Jessie reached for the cloth in her hands, his fingers brushing against hers. She hesitated for a brief moment before relinquishing it, watching as he dipped it into the water. His touch was careful, almost reverent, as he rolled up her sleeve and dabbed at the wound. "Does it hurt?" he asked quietly, his voice low and rough around the edges. Charlotte swallowed. "Not as much as I thought it would." His eyes met hers then, and for a fleeting moment the room seemed smaller, the space between them charged with something unspoken. The battle had changed things between them. The town's survival had come at a cost, but it had also forged something new, something fragile but real. Jesse finished tending to her wound, but didn't pull away immediately. Instead, he let his fingers linger for just a second longer than necessary, his thumb grazing lightly against her skin. Charlotte's breath hitched. She could have pulled away. Should have, but she didn't. The next morning, the town of Redemption stirred with a sense of resilience. The battle had left scars, but it had also brought something unexpected, a shift, a change in the way people looked at each other. People who had once been wary of Jesse now nodded in quiet gratitude as he passed. Women who had kept their distance from Charlotte now whispered thanks, offering small gestures, fresh bread, an extra pair of hands at the schoolhouse. At the center of it all, Jesse and Charlotte stood side by side, watching as the town slowly began to rebuild. Tom Miller, his arm now in a proper sling, approached them. He looked at Jesse with something close to admiration. "I never thought I'd say this, McCall, but this town owes you." Jesse shook his head. "You don't owe me anything." Tom's lips quirked into a small smile. "Maybe not. But that doesn't mean we don't appreciate what you did." Mrs. Jenkins appeared next, offering Charlotte a bundle of fresh cloth for bandages. "You've got a healer's touch," she said warmly. "Don't think we could have done this without you," Charlotte smiled, the warmth of the town's appreciation settling into her bones. She had come here to teach, but she had found something far greater, a sense of belonging. Jesse caught her eye, and though he didn't say anything, there was a quiet understanding in his gaze. They had done this, together. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jesse and Charlotte found themselves walking along the outskirts of town. The world felt different now, still battered, still recovering, but alive. Charlotte glanced over at him, studying the quiet contemplation on his face. "You're thinking about leaving," she said softly. Jesse sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I was." She waited, letting the silence stretch between them. "But now," he continued, his voice rough, "I don't know any more." Charlotte inhaled deeply, letting the cool evening air fill her lungs. "You don't have to run, Jesse. Not any more." He turned to look at her, something unreadable in his expression. "You really believe that?" She nodded. "I do." He exhaled, his hands resting on his belt as he gazed out over the horizon. "I've spent my whole life looking for a way to outrun my past. Thought if I kept moving it couldn't catch up." Charlotte reached out then, resting a gentle hand on his forearm. "Maybe the only way to outrun it is to stop running." His gaze dropped to where her hand rested against his sleeve, the warmth of her touch grounding him. "Stay," she said softly. "Redemption needs you." Jesse swallowed hard. "And you?" Charlotte's heart skipped. She could feel the weight of the question, the depth of what he was really asking. Did she need him? Could she allow herself to? She could have spoken then, could have given him the answer he might have expected, but instead she reached up and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. A quiet promise. She didn't need to say the words. Because in that moment, as the town of Redemption continued its slow path to healing, Jesse and Charlotte both realized something. They weren't just rebuilding a town, they were rebuilding themselves. Together. The stars blinked to life in the darkening sky as Jesse and Charlotte stood side by side, watching the town settle into the night. There were still challenges ahead. The past still lingered in the shadows, waiting for a reckoning. But tonight, for the first time, the future didn't feel so uncertain. And as Jessie squeezed her hand in silent agreement, Charlotte knew, whatever came next, they would face it together. Hope had finally found its place in redemption. and so had they. Chapter 7. Quiet after the storm. The town of Redemption stirred with the slow rhythm of healing. The battle was over, and though scars remained, life pushed forward with quiet resilience. The dust from the fight had settled, leaving behind a town forever changed, not just in the buildings that needed repair, but in the hearts of the people who had fought for it. Charlotte Harper stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse watching as the town square slowly came back to life. The general store had reopened, and townsfolk bustled about gathering supplies to rebuild. Children chased one another through the streets, their laughter a welcome sound after so many days of fear. And at the centre of it all was Jessie McCall. She spotted him near the blacksmith's shop, sleeves rolled up, helping to reinforce a wooden frame that had taken damage during the attack. His movements were sure, efficient, as if he had always belonged here. The people who had once eyed him with suspicion now approached him with nods of appreciation, the weight of gratitude heavy in the air. Charlotte smiled softly to herself, the sight filling her with warmth she hadn't anticipated. "You gonna stand there watching all day?" She turned to find Jessie approaching, his signature smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. His face was still bruised from the fight, a faint cut above his eyebrow, but his blue eyes were clear, steady. "I might," she teased, crossing her arms. "You make for an interesting spectacle." He huffed a laugh, brushing dust from his hands before pulling a small tin cup from his belt. "Figured you could use this." She accepted the cup of coffee he handed her, their fingers grazing in the exchange. The warmth of the drink seeped through her fingers, but it was nothing compared to the quiet heat that flickered in Jessie's gaze. They stood there for a moment, sipping their coffee in companionable silence, watching the town wake up around them. It was such a simple thing, this moment, but it felt different. It felt like home. As the day wore on, Charlotte and Jessie walked through the town square, the dust of the streets kicked up by their slow steps. "You ever think about where we started?" Charlotte mused, her gaze drifting toward the church, where their hasty vows had been spoken. Jessie followed her line of sight, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. "Yeah," he admitted. "Didn't think we'd end up here." "Neither did I," she murmured. They paused near the livery, where a group of men were working to mend a broken fence. Jessie leaned against the post, watching them for a long moment before turning back to her. "I spent most of my life running," he said quietly. "Figured I'd never belong anywhere long enough for it to matter." Charlotte studied him, hearing the unspoken truth in his words. "And now?" He exhaled, glancing around the town, at the people who had come to trust him, at the place that had once seemed temporary but now felt like something more. His gaze finally settled on her. "Now, I don't want to run," he admitted. "Not from this, not from you." The words sent something fluttering inside Charlotte's chest, but she swallowed it down, nodding. "Good," she said simply. Jessie smirked, but there was softness in his expression, something unguarded. "Yeah, I think so too." That night, under the vast expanse of the starry sky, Jessie and Charlotte sat side by side on a small hill just beyond the town. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of earth and grass, the quiet hum of the night wrapping around them like a familiar blanket. Charlotte tilted her head back, her gaze tracing the constellations above. "I used to think I had everything figured out," she admitted softly, "that I knew exactly what my life would be." Jessie's fingers toyed with a blade of grass beside him. "And now," she let out a breath, smiling slightly, "now I realized life doesn't care much for plans." Jessie chuckled, shaking his head. "Ain't that the truth?" Silence settled between them. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of unsaid words, of emotions neither of them had dared to name. Then Jessie turned to her, his voice quieter now, rough with something real. "Charlotte?" She met his gaze, her heartbeat quickening. "This wasn't supposed to be anything more than a deal," he continued, his thumb rubbing absently over the callous skin of his palm. "A marriage of convenience. That's what we said." She nodded, feeling the weight of what he was about to say. But it's not just that anymore, he admitted. His voice low, his words deliberate. Not for me. Charlotte's breath caught. Jessie exhaled, raking a hand through his hair as if he were trying to find the right words. You came into my life when I didn't think I deserved a second chance, but you gave it to me anyway, and somewhere along the way I stopped seeing this as something temporary. Charlotte swallowed past the lump in her throat. Neither did I. His gaze sharpened, searching hers. Are you sure? She let out a breathless laugh, shaking her head. Jessie, I don't know when it happened. I don't know how. But I do know this. When I think about the future, I don't see it without you. Something flickered in his expression, something raw and unguarded. Jessie reached for her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. That's all I needed to hear. Charlotte squeezed his hand, and in that moment the weight of everything, the past, the battle, the uncertainty, lifted. This wasn't just necessity anymore, it was love. The next morning, as the sun crested the horizon, Jessie and Charlotte stood in the town square, a small sapling in front of them. The soil was fresh, dark against the pale wood of the shovel Jessie held. A few townspeople had gathered, watching with quiet curiosity. Charlotte knelt, pressing her hands into the dirt, steadying the fragile roots of the tree. Jessie stood beside her, rolling his shoulders before driving the shovel into the earth, covering the roots carefully. Tom Miller, arms crossed over his chest, smirked. Didn't peg you as a man to plant trees, McCall. Jessie huffed a laugh. Guess I'm full of surprises. Charlotte dusted off her hands, smiling up at him. It's a start. Jessie looked down at the sapling, watching as it swayed gently in the morning breeze. Yeah, he said, his voice softer now. It is a symbol of growth, a symbol of hope, a symbol of the future they would build together. And as Jessie reached for Charlotte's hand, squeezing it gently, they both knew this was only the beginning. The town had quieted as dusk settled over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of lavender and rose. A soft breeze whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of earth and wood smoke. The world felt still, suspended in the delicate balance between day and night, between past and future. Jessie McCall stood near the sapling they had planted that morning, his fingers brushing absently over the leaves, his mind restless despite the calm. The town square was nearly empty now, but he knew she was near, Charlotte. He turned, and there she was, standing at the edge of the square, watching him with an unreadable expression. The light of the lanterns cast a golden glow over her face, illuminating the softness in her features, the quiet strength in her eyes. For so long they had been bound by necessity, by an agreement forged in survival rather than affection. But everything had changed. Jessie took a slow step toward her, his boots scuffing against the dirt. Charlotte didn't move, didn't speak, but her eyes never left his. Then, as if drawn by an invisible force, they met in the middle, standing inches apart, the space between them charged with something deeper than words. Jessie exhaled, his hand lifting to cup her cheek, his callous fingers reverent against her smooth skin. He felt her breath hitch, saw the way her lashes fluttered as she tilted her head ever so slightly into his touch. I never thought I'd have this, he admitted quietly, his voice raw. Charlotte swallowed hard. Have what? This feeling, he murmured, like I've finally found where I belong. Her lips parted, a small breath escaping, but still she didn't look away. You do belong, Jessie. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it held the weight of conviction, of certainty. With me. Something inside him cracked wide open. Without hesitation, he pulled her against him, wrapping his arms around her in an embrace that spoke of everything. The battles they had fought, the fears they had silenced, the walls they had torn down for each other. Charlotte melted into him, her arms winding around his waist, her cheek resting against his chest. She could hear the steady rhythm of his heart, could feel the warmth of his body against hers. This was home. Jessie pressed a kiss to the top of her head, his grip tightening as if he could hold on to this moment forever. I love you, Charlotte. A soft sound escaped her, something between a laugh and a sigh, as she tilted her face up to meet his gaze. "I love you too." The words settled between them, final and unshakable. Not an obligation, not a necessity, a choice. A commitment beyond convenience, beyond the circumstances that had first brought them together. Jessie cupped the back of her head, his thumb tracing a slow, reverent path along her cheek. Then, slowly, he dipped his head and kissed her. It was soft at first, tentative, like the first touch of morning sunlight on the horizon. But then she kissed him back, and the warmth between them ignited, deepening into something more. It was a promise, a vow that no piece of paper could ever match. When they finally pulled apart, Charlotte smiled up at him, her fingers curling against the fabric of his shirt. "So, what now?" she asked, teasing but earnest. Jessie let out a slow breath, his forehead resting against hers. "Now," he said, his voice sure, "we build something real. Together." Charlotte's heart swelled, because for the first time she wasn't standing alone. She was home in every sense of the word. As the last of the lanterns flickered against the night, Jessie and Charlotte stood at the center of redemption, hand in hand, facing the road ahead. The past was behind them, the future stretched out before them. And this time they would walk it together. The town of redemption had never looked so alive. Banners of bright fabric draped across the town square, catching the soft evening breeze. The makeshift stage near the saloon brimmed with energy as musicians plucked lively tunes from their fiddles and guitars, the melodies twirling into the air, coaxing even the most reserved townsfolk into a reluctant dance. Laughter rang out in bursts of joy, a stark contrast to the battle-worn silence that had filled these streets not long ago. Charlotte Harper stood near a cluster of townspeople, her heart swelling as she took it all in. Children darted between the adults, sticky-faced from the sweet honey cakes Mrs. Jenkins had spent the afternoon preparing. Lanterns hung from posts, their soft glow casting a golden light over the smiling faces of men and women who, for the first time in too long, were celebrating instead of surviving. "You're smiling," Jessie's familiar drawl came from behind her. Charlotte turned, finding him standing there with that signature smirk, his blue eyes warm and his shirt sleeves were rolled up, vest unbuttoned, as if even he had allowed himself a moment to ease into the rare comfort of peace. "Of course I'm smiling," she replied, watching as a pair of young girls twirled in circles near the musicians. "We made it! They made it!" Jessie followed her gaze, nodding slowly. "Yeah," he murmured, "we did." She saw it then, the subtle shift in him. Jesse McCall, the man who had once believed himself too far gone for redemption, now stood in the heart of it. Redemption had always been a town struggling to survive. But tonight it was something more. It was thriving. And so was he. Later that night, after the festivities had started to settle into softer conversations and slower melodies, Jessie and Charlotte found themselves on the outskirts of the town square, standing at the edge of the celebration. The lantern light flickered around them, and the music faded into the background as Jessie leaned against the wooden railing of the general store's porch, his hat tilted back, his gaze thoughtful. Charlotte took a sip of the cider she'd been given earlier, the sweet warmth coating her throat before she spoke. "I was scared, you know." Her voice was quiet but steady. Jessie's brows lifted slightly as he turned toward her. "Scared of what?" "That night," she admitted. "The battle, everything, but mostly—" She swallowed, looking up at him. "I was scared I'd lose you." Jessie exhaled slowly, the weight of her words settling deep. He reached out, brushing a stray curl from her cheek, his fingers lingering. "I spent my whole life thinking if I stayed anywhere too long I'd end up losing something," he murmured. "Didn't realize I'd been running from having something to lose in the first place." Charlotte tilted her head, studying him, her heart twisting at the rare vulnerability in his voice. "But you stayed," she whispered. Jessie nodded. "Yeah, I did." They stood there for a long moment, the quiet night stretching between them, filled not with unspoken fears, but with something else, something real. "What now?" she asked, her voice softer now. Jessie let out a slow breath, glancing out at the town before meeting her gaze. "We build," he said simply. "We make sure this place ain't just another forgotten town in the dust. We make it more." Charlotte smiled, warmth spreading through her chest. "The school needs expanding," she mused. "I'd like to bring in more books, and maybe even a second teacher." Jessie smirked. "I was thinking more along the lines of fortifying the town, making sure we don't ever get caught on our heels again." Charlotte laughed, shaking her head. "Course you were." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low murmur. "Maybe both?" She nodded, looking up at him with something close to wonder. "Yes," she said, "maybe both." And just like that, their future began to take shape. Not out of obligation, not out of necessity, but out of choice. Together. 2 years later. The morning sun bathed the town of Redemption in a golden glow, casting long soft shadows across the buildings that had been repaired, rebuilt, and expanded. The schoolhouse, once a modest single-room structure, now had a second wing, its windows open to welcome the crisp autumn breeze. Inside, the sound of children's laughter filled the air, as Charlotte carefully arranged books on a newly built shelf. The scent of freshly cut wood lingered, a testament to Jessie's handiwork. He had kept his promise. The town had flourished, its people standing stronger, more united than ever. And Jessie? Charlotte turned, smiling as she spotted him through the window, leaning against the railing outside, speaking with the sheriff about another expansion to the town's defences. The same outlaw-turned-defender who had once believed himself incapable of being part of something good now stood at the heart of it all. As if sensing her gaze, Jessie glanced up, catching her eyes through the window. He gave her a slow, knowing smile, one that still had the power to send warmth fluttering through her chest. A moment later he stepped inside, walking toward her with the easy confidence she had come to love. "Morning, Mrs. McCall." Charlotte smirked, shaking her head. "You still insist on calling me that?" He grinned. "You going to stop me?" She rolled her eyes, but let him pull her into his arms anyway, relishing the warmth of his embrace. "Busy day?" he murmured against her temple. "Always," she said with a soft sigh. "But it's a good kind of busy." Jessie pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. "Yeah," he agreed, "it is." They stood there for a long moment, the sound of the schoolchildren's laughter mingling with the distant hammering of new construction, the heartbeat of a town that had finally found its place in the world. Charlotte reached for Jessie's hand, lacing her fingers through his. He squeezed gently, a silent promise, one that no contract, no forced marriage could ever match. This wasn't just redemption anymore. It was home. As the sun climbed higher, Jessie and Charlotte stepped outside, their hands still joined. Together they walked toward the town square, where people bustled, where children played, where life continued. Their journey hadn't been easy. Their love hadn't come swiftly, but it had come genuinely, and as they walked side by side into the bright, hopeful morning, Charlotte knew they had found something worth holding on to, something that would last. Something that, much like redemption itself, had been forged in fire, tested by hardship, and made all the stronger for it. And together they would build a future, one step at a time.